Ranger Mason Foster froze mid-step, coffee thermos slipping from his weathered fingers and clattering across the dusty Texas earth. The massive Brahman bull, 1,800 pounds of muscle and primal fury, wasn't attacking the Rangers as expected. It was savagely fighting a python coiled around a motionless female cow. "Jesus Christ," whispered Deputy Harlan, stumbling backward, knocking over equipment as the bull's guttural bellows echoed across the ranch. That's not natural." Dr. Olivia Reed's hand trembled against her medical kit, her gold wedding band, unworn for 3 years since her daughter's funeral, catching the harsh morning light as she watched the bull tear into the serpent with desperate, loving rage. "Nobody move," Mason commanded, though his heart screamed to intervene. Just nobody move. What force could drive this creature to such sacrifice? And why, after 30 years as a ranger, did Mason suddenly feel like he understood nothing about the natural world? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Triple Creek Ranch stretched across 1,500 acres of parched Texas hill country, its brittle grasslands thirsting under an unforgiving summer sun. Once a thriving cattle operation, the ranch had fallen on hard times like many others during the 3-year drought. The main house, a weathered 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch, stood as a stubborn reminder of better days. Mason Foster had patrolled this land as a Texas Parks Wildlife Ranger for over 3 decades. At 65, his once imposing frame had begun to stoop, but the sharp blue eyes beneath his sweat-stained Stetson missed nothing. Today was supposed to be routine, investigating reports of an exotic animal sighting near the ranch's border with state parkland. Now, watching the bull defend its companion, Mason felt the comfortable certainties of his impending retirement crumbling away. "Never seen anything like it in 40 years of veterinary work, Doctor," Olivia Reed murmured, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. At 60, Olivia's face carried the fine lines of a woman who'd spent her life outdoors, but it was the deeper creases, those around her eyes and mouth, that spoke of grief beyond her years. Since losing her daughter Jenny to a car accident 3 years ago, Olivia had poured herself into her work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center she'd established on the eastern edge of Triple Creek. The bull they were watching was known simply as Thunder. Standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder with a distinctive hump of muscle rising behind his massive neck, Thunder was an imposing specimen of the Brahman breed. His hide, silver gray and scarred from previous battles, rippled with strength as he circled protectively around Luna, the fallen cow. The broken right horn that distinguished him caught the morning light like a battle-worn sword. Luna herself was smaller but still impressive, with the characteristic Brahman drooping ears and gentle face marked with distinctive white patches that local ranchers used to identify her. Rescued 2 years earlier from a neglectful owner, she'd developed an unusual bond with Thunder that had become something of a local legend among the ranching community. What none of them knew, not Mason nearing retirement, not Olivia with her buried grief, not even Catherine Foster, who waited at home wondering why her husband of 40 years found more comfort in open spaces than in their shared life, was that the events unfolding at Triple Creek Ranch would bind their fates together in ways none could imagine. And watching from the ridge above, through high-powered binoculars, was Victor Crawford. Once a respected veterinarian, now a man consumed by bitterness and greed, Victor saw dollar signs where others saw tragedy. The Brahman bull would fetch a premium price from collectors who asked no questions about origins. His weathered face, so similar to his estranged sister Olivia's, twisted into something resembling a smile. "Quite a show," he whispered to himself, adjusting his position on the ridge. Quite a show indeed. The python's massive coils tightened around Luna's midsection, each constriction forcing precious air from her lungs. The snake, likely an escaped or deliberately released Burmese python that had no business in the Texas ecosystem, had caught the female Brahmin as she drank from the remaining creek that still trickled through Triple Creek's parched landscape. Now the reptile's diamond-patterned body glistened obscenely in the morning sun, a living vice slowly crushing the life from its victim. Mason Foster's decades of ranger training kicked in as he assessed the situation, his mind calculating options while his body remained perfectly still. "Olivia," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the scene. "Tranquilizer options?" Dr. Reed shook her head slightly. "Risky. Hit the python. It might constrict harder before passing out. Hit the bull. We lose our best chance at saving her." Her clinical tone betrayed none of the turmoil visible in her eyes. Thunder circled the python and Luna, his massive hooves kicking up dust clouds as he pawed the ground. The bull's eyes, dark, intelligent, and filled with what Mason could only describe as rage, never left the snake. When Thunder charged, the sound that erupted from his throat wasn't the typical bellow of an angry bull. It was something primal, something that sent shivers down the spines of everyone watching. "My God," Deputy Harlan whispered. "He's trying to save her." Thunder's attack was calculated in a way that defied animal instinct. He didn't simply charge, he targeted the python's head, massive horns driving down with surgical precision. When the snake's head darted toward him, Thunder pivoted with surprising agility for an animal his size, then stomped with punishing force on the middle section of the python's body. Mason had seen bullfights before, had even responded to calls where bulls had gored handlers or each other. But this was different. This wasn't blind aggression or territorial display. This was purposeful, protective. The broken right horn that gave Thunder his distinctive appearance became a precision instrument as he maneuvered to separate the snake from Luna. "We need to help," Olivia said, reaching for her tranquilizer rifle. "That snake's at least 18 feet. Even Thunder can't—" Her words cut off as the python struck, fangs sinking into Thunder's muscled shoulder. The bull didn't retreat. Instead, he drove forward, accepting the bite to gain leverage. With a violent twist of his massive head, Thunder's remaining horn caught beneath a section of the python's coils and heaved upward, loosening the death grip around Luna's midsection. Mason didn't wait for further discussion. "Harlan, get the snake hooks from the truck. Jenkins, bring the capture bags. We move on my signal." His voice carried the unquestioned authority of a man who'd spent his life making life-or-death decisions in the wilderness. Luna's sides heaved as she struggled for breath, her normally gentle eyes wide with pain and fear. The python, sensing its prey might escape, redoubled its efforts, muscular coils rippling as it adjusted its grip. Thunder roared again, this time with a note of desperation that sounded disturbingly human. "Now!" Mason shouted, and the Rangers moved as one, converging on the scene with practiced efficiency. Olivia Reed was the first to reach Luna, medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. Mason and Deputy Harlan focused on the python's head, using specialized hooks to control its striking range while Jenkins worked to unwind the massive coils from Luna's body. Thunder, remarkably, didn't charge the humans. Instead, he continued targeting the sections of the snake still wrapped around Luna, as if understanding the Ranger's intentions. "He's working with us," Mason said incredulously, dodging a strike from the increasingly agitated python. "Never seen anything like it." "Focus, Mason," Olivia snapped, her hands moving quickly over Luna's heaving sides, assessing damage. "This cow has minutes, not hours." The python, realizing it was outmatched, began to release its prey, seeking escape rather than a meal. As the last coil slithered free, Thunder immediately positioned himself between the snake and Luna, massive head lowered in clear warning. "Get back!" Mason ordered as the python, now fully disengaged, whipped around seeking targets. Harlan wasn't fast enough. The snake's tail caught him across the chest, sending him sprawling into the dust. Mason's snake hook found the back of the python's head, pinning it just long enough for Jenkins to secure a proper grip behind its jaws. The capture that followed was textbook, the kind of procedure Mason had performed dozens of times in his career, but nothing about the aftermath followed any protocol he'd ever encountered. As Rangers secured the python in transport containers, Thunder didn't charge, didn't flee, didn't behave like any bull Mason had encountered in 30 years of wildlife management. Instead, he lowered his massive frame to the ground beside Luna, positioning himself so his body supported her heaving sides. "She's got crush injuries," Olivia reported, hands still moving over Luna's body. "Possible fractured ribs. Respiratory distress. We need to get her to the center." Her eyes flicked to Thunder, then back to Mason. "But we've got a complication." The complication was 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed nearly a ton. Thunder refused to move from Luna's side, even as Olivia administered emergency treatment. When Rangers approached with a transport harness for Luna, Thunder's posture changed, not aggressively but protectively. He didn't charge, but the message in his stance was clear. Luna wasn't going anywhere without him. "We trank him, we can move her," Harlan suggested, nursing bruised ribs from his fall. Mason shook his head. "After what he just did, doesn't seem right." "Since when do we base wildlife management decisions on what seems right, Foster?" Jenkins asked, but there was no bite in the question. Everyone present had been affected by what they'd witnessed. Olivia looked up from tending Luna, her eyes meeting Mason's with understanding that transcended their professional relationship. "We've got the extended trailer, if we partition it properly." She left the suggestion hanging. "You want to transport a 2,000-pound bull with a cow he's just fought a python for? That's not in any procedure manual I've read," Harlan said. Mason adjusted his hat. Decision already made. "Been doing this job longer than those manuals have been printed, son. Sometimes you gotta trust what you see in front of you, instead of what's written on a page." He turned to Olivia. "We'll do it your way, Doc. But if that bull decides to redecorate the inside of my trailer with someone's face, I'm writing you up for the paperwork." The ghost of a smile touched Olivia's lips, the first Mason had seen since they'd arrived on scene. "Fair enough, Ranger Foster." What followed was an improvisation of the highest order. Using portable barriers, the team created a divided space in the extended wildlife trailer. Luna was carefully lifted onto a reinforced stretcher and placed in the larger section. Thunder watched every movement, muscles tensed but controlled, as if assessing each human's intentions. The true test came when they needed to load Thunder. Mason had participated in enough bull loadings to know they typically involved multiple handlers, specialized equipment, and often a fair amount of cursing. He braced for struggle but kept his voice calm as they opened the trailer's secondary compartment. "All right, big fella," he said quietly. "Your lady's inside. You want to go with her, you got to use the door like a gentleman." Whether it was Mason's tone, the scent of Luna, or some understanding beyond human comprehension, Thunder approached the trailer with none of the resistance Mason expected. The massive bull paused at the ramp, nostrils flaring as he caught Luna's scent, then walked up and into the compartment with dignity that left the Rangers staring in disbelief. 30 years, Mason muttered, securing the trailer door. 30 years, and I'm still seeing firsts. As they prepared to depart for Olivia's Wildlife Center, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they'd witnessed something profound, something that challenged the comfortable definitions separating human emotion from animal instinct. His gaze drifted to the ridgeline where for a moment he thought he glimpsed movement, a figure watching, but when he looked more carefully, there was nothing but the heat shimmer rising from sun-baked rocks. "You coming, Foster?" Olivia called from the medical truck. Mason nodded, pushing aside the uneasy feeling. "Right behind you, Doc." In the trailer, Thunder stood as close to the partition as possible, his massive body angled toward Luna. Occasionally, he would make a low rumbling sound, and Luna, despite her injuries, would respond with a soft lowing of her own. It was a conversation no human present could translate, but every one of them understood. The caravan of vehicles kicked up dust along the rural access road leading to Olivia Reed's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Mason drove the lead truck pulling the specialized trailer, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. In the passenger seat, Olivia monitored Luna's vitals through a tablet connected to sensors they'd managed to attach before transport. Respiration still labored, she reported, professional tone masking her concern. Pulse elevated but steady. Mason nodded, eyes fixed on the road. "And our boy back there?" Surprisingly calm. "He's standing, alert." Olivia switched camera views on her tablet. "He's positioned himself against the partition as close to her as possible." The rehabilitation center appeared around the bend, a collection of repurposed ranch buildings Olivia had transformed after her daughter's death. What had once been the main barn now housed a fully equipped veterinary facility, while various outbuildings had been converted to species-specific recovery areas. It wasn't state-of-the-art, but it was more sophisticated than anything else within 100 miles. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Mason spotted a familiar sedan parked near the main house. "Catherine's here," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Olivia glanced up from her tablet. "Your wife? I thought she never visited your work sites." "She doesn't." Mason's brow furrowed as he parked the trailer near the treatment barn. "Something must be wrong." Catherine Foster stood on the porch of the small house that served as the center's office, arms crossed over her chest. At 63, she retained the straight posture of her decades as an elementary school teacher, her silver-streaked dark hair cut in a practical bob. As Mason approached, he noted the tightness around her mouth, a sign he'd learned to recognize over 40 years of marriage. "Retirement paperwork came," she said without preamble. "Needs your signature today. I tried calling." Mason patted his pocket where his phone should have been. "Left it in the truck. We had an emergency call." Catherine's eyes drifted to the activity behind him, where Olivia was directing the team preparing to unload Luna. "Always an emergency, isn't there?" The resignation in her voice carried decades of missed dinners and postponed vacations. "Kath, I just signed the papers, Mason." She held out a folder. "I told them I'd bring them back before the office closes." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted behind them. Thunder, sensing the team's approach to the trailer, had begun to vocalize, deep, resonant bellows that carried across the property. "What in God's name is that?" Catherine asked, momentarily distracted from her frustration. Mason took the folder. "That's part of my emergency. Brahman bull protecting his—" He hesitated. "Friend. Never seen anything like it." Something in his tone caught Catherine's attention. In 40 years together, she'd heard Mason describe countless animal encounters with professional detachment. This was different. "You should see this," he said, an unexpected gentleness in his voice. "Might be the last remarkable thing I witnessed before turning in my badge." Catherine hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll wait." The process of unloading Luna required careful coordination. Olivia had assembled her small staff, 2 veterinary technicians and an intern, around the trailer's larger compartment. The challenge wasn't just moving the injured cow. It was doing so without triggering a protective response from Thunder. "We'll sedate her lightly," Olivia explained to the team, "just enough to keep her calm during transport to the treatment room." Everyone moves slowly, speaks quietly. Mason rejoined them, positioning himself near the smaller compartment that held Thunder. "What's the plan for him?" "We'll move Luna first. Once she's secure in treatment, we can assess him for injuries from the snake bite." Mason shook his head. "He's not going to let her out of his sight willingly." Olivia's eyes met his, acknowledging the truth of his statement. What do you suggest? Let him see everything. Open both compartments simultaneously. Show him where she's going. From the sidelines, Catherine watched with growing interest as her husband, normally a by-the-book ranger who quoted regulations like scripture, advocated for a highly unorthodox approach. Department procedure, one of the technicians began, isn't written for this situation, Mason finished firmly. Trust me on this. Olivia nodded, adjusting the plan. When both trailer compartments were opened, Thunder's massive frame appeared in the smaller doorway, his dark eyes immediately finding Luna on her stretcher. A low rumble emanated from his chest, not threatening, but clearly communicative. Luna, despite her sedation, responded with a soft, lowing sound. The exchange sent chills down the spines of everyone watching. "My God," whispered Catherine from her position on the porch. With exquisite care, the team began moving Luna's stretcher toward the treatment barn. Thunder watched intently, then, to everyone's astonishment, stepped down from the trailer with deliberate calm and followed, maintaining a precise distance that allowed the humans to work, but kept Luna in his sight. "He's escorting her," Mason said quietly to Catherine, who had moved to his side. Inside the treatment facility, Olivia's team transferred Luna to an examination table reinforced to support large animals. The real challenge came when they needed to close the treatment room doors, standard protocol for maintaining sterility during procedures. Thunder planted himself in the doorway, immovable as a statue. "We can't have him in a sterile environment," Olivia's lead technician protested. "The risk of infection is less than the risk of trying to move a 2,000-pound bull against his will," Mason countered. Olivia, already scrubbing for the procedure, made a quick decision. "Partial quarantine. We'll section off the treatment area with the portable barriers. He can see her but not access the sterile field." Mason nodded in agreement. "I'll stay with him. Keep him calm." Using portable screens and barriers, they created a makeshift observation area where Thunder could maintain visual contact with Luna while the medical team worked. To everyone's surprise, once he could see that Luna was being cared for, Thunder settled onto his haunches, his massive frame remarkably still except for the occasional swivel of his ears when Luna made a sound. Catherine, who had followed them inside out of curiosity, stood beside Mason as they watched Olivia work. "He really understands what's happening," she said softly. "Doesn't he?" "Sure seems that way." Mason's voice carried a note of wonder that Catherine hadn't heard in years. "In all my time with parks and wildlife, I've never seen anything like it." Olivia's examination of Luna was thorough and efficient. 3 fractured ribs, she reported without looking up from her work. Significant bruising to the thoracic cavity. Some internal bleeding but contained respiratory distress from the constriction. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she stabilized the fractures and administered medications. "Prognosis?" Mason asked. "Guarded but positive. She's young, healthy otherwise, with proper care and rest." Olivia finally glanced up, her eyes moving from Luna to Thunder, who remained vigilant. "The real question is what we do with him." "Standard procedure would be to return him to the herd," Mason said, though his tone suggested he was reciting rather than recommending. "He'd break down fences to get back to her," Catherine said unexpectedly. When both Mason and Olivia looked at her in surprise, she shrugged. "I taught Charlotte's Web to 3rd graders for 30 years. I know devotion when I see it." A ghost of a smile touched Olivia's tired face. "Your wife has good instincts, Ranger Foster." As the treatment continued, Mason stepped outside to check in with his team and file the initial report on the python capture. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, the day's heat beginning to soften into evening. As he finished his call, a movement near the tree line caught his attention, the same sensation of being watched he'd experienced at the capture site. This time he was certain he glimpsed a figure ducking behind an outbuilding. Training and instinct taking over, Mason circled around, moving quietly despite his size. When he rounded the corner, he found himself face to face with a man in his early 60s, weather-beaten and hard-eyed, slipping a high-powered camera into a worn backpack. "This is private property," Mason said, hand instinctively moving to where his service weapon would normally be. The man straightened, showing no sign of intimidation. "Public road runs right past it. Free country last I checked." Something about the man's demeanor, confident, calculating, raised Mason's internal alarms. "You've been following our operation since Triple Creek. Why?" A thin smile spread across the man's face. "Professional interest, let's say." "That's quite a bull you've got there. Specimen like that's worth a lot to the right buyer. He's not for sale, and you still haven't told me who you are." "Name's Crawford, Victor Crawford." The man extended a hand that Mason deliberately didn't take. "Used to be in veterinary medicine. Now I'm in specialized livestock acquisition." The euphemism wasn't lost on Mason. "Poaching, you mean?" Crawford's smile didn't waver. "Such an ugly word for a simple business transaction. Exotic game ranches pay premium for unique specimens. That Brahman's behavior, protecting the female like that, makes him even more valuable. Imagine the breeding possibilities." Disgust rose in Mason's throat. "You need to leave. Now." "Of course, Ranger." Crawford gathered his backpack. "Just satisfying my curiosity. No law against that." He started to walk away, then paused. "Give Dr. Reed my regards." "Been a long time since we've spoken, but family's family, right?" Before Mason could process the implication, Crawford was walking briskly toward a mud-spattered truck parked on the access road. Mason watched him go, the unease in his gut deepening into something more concrete. He'd encountered poachers throughout his career, but something about Crawford's confidence and the casual mention of Olivia suggested complications beyond a simple trespassing incident. When Mason returned to the treatment area, he found a transformed scene. Luna had been stabilized and moved to a recovery stall with lowered sides that allowed Thunder to see and even reach her with his massive head. The bull had positioned himself as close as the barriers allowed, occasionally making soft rumbling sounds that Luna weakly answered. Catherine sat on a stool nearby, watching the animals with undisguised fascination. "She's responding to him," she told Mason as he approached. "Doctor Reed says her vitals improve when he's close." Mason settled beside his wife, the encounter with Crawford temporarily pushed aside by the remarkable scene before them. "You didn't have to stay." "I wanted to." Catherine's eyes remained on the animals. "It's important, somehow." The simple admission hung between them, an acknowledgment that transcended their recent pattern of perfunctory conversations in parallel lives. Mason found himself remembering their early years together, before the job consumed him, when they'd shared wonder at the world rather than schedules and grocery lists. As twilight deepened outside, Olivia joined them, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "We've done all we can for now. The next 12 hours will tell us more." She glanced at the animals, then back at the Fosters. "You two should go home, get some rest." "What about Thunder?" Mason asked. "He needs treatment too. That snake got him good on the shoulder." "Already done. One of my techs managed to clean and treat the bite while he was focused on Luna. Minimal venom, mostly mechanical damage from the fangs. He didn't even seem to notice." Mason shook his head in amazement. "And tonight? He can't stay in the treatment room indefinitely." Olivia's gaze drifted to the animals, her expression softening. "I've seen enough tonight to know I'm not separating them unless absolutely necessary. We'll make arrangements." As Mason and Catherine prepared to leave, his thoughts returned to the encounter with Crawford. The mention of family connection to Olivia troubled him deeply. "Dr. Reed," he said as they reached the door, "do you know someone named Victor Crawford?" The effect was immediate and disturbing. Olivia's professional composure shattered, color draining from her face as if she'd been struck. "Where did you hear that name?" Her voice had dropped to a whisper. "He was here, watching the facility. Mentioned you, said something about family." Olivia's hand found the doorframe for support. "Victor was my brother." The words seemed to physically pain her. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. Not since the accident." Catherine, sensing the sudden tension, touched Mason's arm. "We should go. Let Dr. Reed rest." But Mason couldn't let it go. Not with the predatory interest Crawford had shown in Thunder. "He's scouting the bull, Olivia. Professional interest, he called it." A flash of something, rage perhaps, or fear, crossed Olivia's tired face. "Victor lost his veterinary license for malpractice years ago. If he's interested in your bull, it's not for anything legitimate." She straightened, professional mask slipping back into place. "I'll increase security tonight." "Don't worry." As they drove home in silence, Mason's mind churned with the day's events, the extraordinary behavior of the animals, Crawford's ominous presence, and the undeniable connection that had sparked between Catherine and himself while watching Thunder's devotion to Luna. "You're thinking about staying, aren't you?" Catherine finally asked, breaking the silence. "Delaying retirement." Mason sighed, hands flexing on the steering wheel. "Just until we sort this situation out. Something's not right." To his surprise, Catherine nodded. "I think that's a good idea." When he glanced at her questioningly, she continued, "What we saw today, it matters, Mason. I don't quite understand why, but it does." As they turned onto the gravel road leading to their modest home, memories of Vietnam suddenly flashed through Mason's mind, unbidden and unwelcome. The jungles, the fear, the loss of his best friend Tucker in an ambush Mason had survived by mere chance. The guilt that had driven him into wildlife service, the promise he'd made to never again leave anyone behind. "You're having the dreams again," Catherine observed quietly, reading his expression with the accuracy of long marriage. "Might be," he admitted. "Been a while." Catherine's hand found his as they parked. "Thunder reminds you of Tucker, doesn't he? The way he wouldn't leave his friend behind." Mason closed his eyes briefly, the parallel striking him with physical force. Maybe he does at that. As they entered their home, Mason knew sleep would be elusive tonight. Between the echoes of the past and the uncertainties of the present, his mind would find little rest. Yet somehow the image of Thunder standing guard over Luna provided a strange comfort, a reminder that loyalty and devotion existed in forms beyond human understanding. Dawn broke over the rehabilitation center with the gentle persistence of a Texas summer morning, painting the eastern sky in watercolor strokes of amber and rose. Mason Foster arrived earlier than necessary, the unsigned retirement papers still tucked in his truck's glove compartment. He found Olivia Reed in the treatment barn, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she hadn't left since they'd departed the night before. "You look like you could use some coffee," Mason said, offering one of the 2 travel mugs he carried. Olivia accepted with a grateful nod. "Been up most of the night. Luna developed a fever around 2 a.m. Mason's gaze shifted to the recovery stall where Luna lay on a bed of clean straw, her breathing visibly labored even from a distance. Thunder remained in his position from the previous evening, his massive frame somehow wedged as close to the partition as physically possible. "How's she doing now?" "Stable, but guarded. The antibiotics are fighting the infection, but her system took quite a hit from the constriction injuries." Olivia sipped the coffee, closing her eyes briefly at the simple comfort. "The remarkable thing is him." Mason followed her gaze to Thunder. "What about him?" "He hasn't slept. Not really. Hasn't eaten. Every time her vitals fluctuated, he knew somehow started making these low vocalizations that seemed to— I know this sounds crazy, but they seemed to calm her. Mason wasn't surprised. After what he'd witnessed the day before, he was prepared to reevaluate much of what he thought he knew about animal behavior. Nothing about this situation fits the textbooks, that's for sure. They stood in companionable silence, watching the animals. Thunder's head rested on the lowered partition, his massive nostrils occasionally flaring as he drew in Luna's scent. Once, when Luna shifted uncomfortably, Thunder made a soft rumbling sound that seemed to ease her distress. "Your brother," Mason finally said, keeping his voice casual. "Want to tell me what that's about?" Olivia's posture stiffened. "Not particularly. He's showing predatory interest in a bull under my protection. Makes it my business." A heavy sigh escaped her. "Victor was once a brilliant veterinarian. Better than me, if I'm honest. But he had problems. Drinking, cutting corners. 3 years ago, he was driving drunk and caused an accident." Her voice faltered. "My daughter Jenny was in the other car." Mason's breath caught. "Jesus, Olivia. I'm sorry." "Victor walked away without a scratch. Jenny died 3 days later in the ICU. I sat with her the whole time, just like Thunder's sitting with Luna now." Olivia's clinical detachment cracked, revealing the raw grief beneath. "He lost his license after that. Not for the accident, ironically, but for a pattern of malpractice that came to light during the investigation. And now, he's what? A poacher? I don't know what he is anymore. We haven't spoken since the funeral." Olivia's gaze drifted back to the animals. "The last I heard, he was working with private exotic game ranches, the kind where rich men pay to shoot captive animals and call it hunting." Mason's jaw tightened. In his career, he'd encountered many such operations, some legal, many skirting the edges of wildlife trafficking laws. "If he's targeting Thunder, then he's not acting alone," Olivia finished. "Victor knows animals, but he's not equipped to transport a bull that size. He'd need resources, connections." Before Mason could respond, the barn door opened, admitting Catherine Foster carrying a wicker basket. She looked surprisingly at home in jeans and a chambray shirt, a departure from her usual neat slacks and blouses. "Brought breakfast," she announced. "Figured nobody had thought about food." Mason blinked in surprise. "You drove all the way out here to bring breakfast?" Catherine set the basket on a nearby table. "I brought more than breakfast. Called in a substitute for my volunteer shift at the library and packed a bag. Thought I might be useful here for a few days." Her eyes met Mason's, challenging him to question her decision. Instead, he felt a surge of warmth. "Could always use an extra pair of hands," he said simply. Olivia watched their exchange with tired curiosity. "There's a spare room in the main house if you're staying. Nothing fancy, but it's clean." "Perfect." Catherine began unpacking the basket, revealing still warm biscuits, a thermos of gravy, and containers of fresh fruit. "Now both of you eat something. You look like you're running on fumes." The domesticity of the moment, sharing breakfast in the quiet of the barn while monitoring their unusual patients, created a strange bubble of normalcy in what had become an increasingly extraordinary situation. Mason found himself watching Catherine as she moved with practical efficiency, setting out paper plates and plastic utensils, her silver-streaked hair caught in morning light. When had he stopped seeing her like this? When had his wife become a background fixture in his life rather than its center? Their meal was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Harlan, his expression unusually grave. "Morning, folks," he said, declining Catherine's offer of food with a polite wave. "We've got a situation, Mason." "What kind of situation?" "That python y'all captured yesterday. It's gone. Someone broke into the containment facility overnight." Mason set down his coffee mug. "Signs of forced entry?" "That's the thing. Whoever did it knew the security codes." Inside job or someone with serious connections. Harlan glanced at Olivia, then back to Mason. There's more. We found tire tracks matching a vehicle that was reported near 3 other exotic animal thefts in the past month. A cold certainty settled in Mason's gut. Crawford. Olivia paled at the name. You think Victor stole the python? Or had it stolen, Mason said. Question is why? That snake was evidence in an active investigation. Covering tracks, maybe, Harlan suggested. If the python was deliberately released as some kind of diversion. The implication hung in the air. Mason's eyes drifted to Thunder, still maintaining his vigilant position beside Luna. If the python attack had been orchestrated rather than a random wildlife incident, it suggested a level of calculation that made Victor Crawford far more dangerous than a simple opportunistic poacher. We need to increase security here, Mason decided. Thunder's still Crawford's likely target, and now we know he's got resources. Olivia nodded. I'll have my staff work in shifts. Nobody's alone on the property, no exceptions. I can help, Catherine offered. I may be retired, but I still know how to keep an eye on things. Mason felt a surge of protectiveness. Kath, this could get dangerous. Crawford's not just some, don't you dare tell me to go home and wait by the phone, Mason Foster, Catherine interrupted, steel in her voice. I taught teenagers for 35 years. I can handle myself. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Mason felt a smile tug at his lips. This was the Catherine he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd once stood down an angry parent twice her size to protect a student. Yes, ma'am, he said simply. As they formulated a security plan, Luna stirred in her stall, a low moan escaping her. Thunder immediately responded, making the soft rumbling sound they'd come to recognize as his way of comforting her. Olivia moved to check Luna's vitals, her professional mask slipping back into place. Temperature still elevated, she reported. Breathing's labored but stable. Mason joined her at the stall. She going to make it? If determination counts for anything, yes. Olivia's gaze shifted to Thunder. He hasn't left that spot for 18 hours. Hasn't eaten, barely even shifted position. Extraordinary, Catherine murmured, coming to stand beside Mason. More than extraordinary, Olivia said quietly. In all my years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen devotion like this between animals. It's as if... She hesitated, seemingly embarrassed by what she was about to say. As if what? Mason prompted. As if he loves her, Olivia finished. Not just instinct or herd protection. Something deeper. The words hung in the air, challenging the comfortable categories that separated human emotion from animal behavior. Mason found himself remembering Tucker again, the way his friend had crawled through enemy fire to drag Mason to safety during the ambush, the look in his eyes that said leaving wasn't an option. Was that so different from what Thunder was doing for Luna? He needs to eat, Catherine said practically, breaking the philosophical moment. Even devotion needs fuel. Olivia nodded. We've tried offering food. He ignores it completely. Have you tried feeding him near her? Catherine asked. Where he doesn't have to choose between eating and keeping watch? The simplicity of the suggestion caught both Mason and Olivia off guard. Worth a try, Olivia admitted. When fresh hay and grain were placed within Thunder's reach but still close to Luna, the bull finally accepted nourishment, though his eyes never left his companion. It was a small victory, but it reinforced the growing understanding that Thunder's behavior, while extraordinary, followed its own consistent logic. As the day progressed, Mason established a security perimeter around the facility, working with Harlan to position game cameras and motion sensors at strategic points. Catherine, meanwhile, revealed unexpected aptitude for animal care, assisting Olivia's staff with routine tasks while maintaining a calm, watchful presence in the treatment barn. By late afternoon, Luna showed signs of improvement. Her fever reduced slightly and her breathing became less labored. Thunder, sensing the change, became more alert, his posture shifting from dejected vigilance to hopeful attention. When Luna managed to lift her head briefly, Thunder made a sound unlike any they'd heard before, something between a rumble and a purr. "I believe that's the bull equivalent of celebration," Olivia remarked, allowing herself a small smile. Mason, returning from a perimeter check, caught the moment. "Good sign?" "Very good. If her improvement continues at this rate, we might be able to move her to the recovery paddock in a few days." The recovery paddock was a small, sheltered field adjacent to the main treatment barn, visible from the building, but offering more space and natural surroundings for convalescing animals. The thought of Luna in the open air, with Thunder beside her rather than separated by barriers, created a hopeful image that lingered in Mason's mind. As evening approached, Olivia insisted that both Fosters take a break from the facility. "Go have dinner. Walk somewhere that doesn't smell like antiseptic and hay. I've got staff here, and Harlan's deputy is on perimeter patrol." Reluctantly, Mason agreed. He and Catherine drove to a small roadside diner they'd frequented in their early years together, but had gradually abandoned for the convenience of home-cooked meals eaten in distracted silence. The place had barely changed. Same red vinyl booths, same overhead fans turning lazily against the Texas heat, same waitress who'd served them decades earlier, now with silver hair instead of brown. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she greeted them with a broad smile. "The Fosters, large as life. Where have you been hiding?" "Working too much," Catherine answered with surprising candor. "Living too little." The simple truth of the statement caught Mason off guard. When had they stopped making time for places like this, for conversations that weren't about schedules or bills? They settled into a booth by the window, ordering without needing to consult the menu, habits unchanged despite their long absence. When their food arrived, Mason found himself watching Catherine as she arranged her napkin, added precisely 2 packets of sugar to her iced tea, all the small rituals he'd once found endearing and had gradually stopped noticing. "Why'd you really come out to the center?" he asked finally. "It's not like you to insert yourself into my work." Catherine stirred her tea thoughtfully. "When you came home yesterday, you had a look I haven't seen in years. Like something mattered to you, really mattered, beyond obligation." "The animals, you mean?" "Not just the animals. What they represent." Catherine met his gaze directly. "You've been marking time, Mason, counting down to retirement like it's a finish line instead of a beginning. Then suddenly you encounter something that makes you question everything you thought you knew, and I see a spark that's been missing for a long time." Mason absorbed her words, recognizing their truth. "And you?" "Me?" Catherine smiled faintly. "I've been marking time too, waiting for my husband to return from a war that ended 40 years ago." The statement landed like a physical blow. "That's not fair, Kath." "Isn't it? You came home from Vietnam, but you never really came back to me. Part of you stayed there with Tucker, with all the things you couldn't save." Her voice softened. "When I saw you watching that bull yesterday, the way he refused to leave his friend, I realized you recognized something in him, something you've been carrying all these years." Mason stared out the window, throat tight with emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. Tucker's face flashed in his memory, young, determined, loyal to the end. "He dragged me to safety," Mason said finally, the words emerging as if pulled from some deep well. "Could have saved himself, but he came back for me. Caught 3 bullets doing it." Catherine reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I know." "No, you don't," Mason said, not unkindly. I never told you the whole story. After Tucker got me to cover, he was still alive. Bleeding bad, but alive. The extraction chopper was coming, but it was taking fire. Could only touch down for seconds. Not enough time for both of us. Catherine's hand tightened on his. Mason, you don't have to. He pushed me toward the chopper, Mason continued, the memory unspooling with vivid clarity. Said, one of us is going home to that pretty wife, ain't gonna be me. Last thing he said was, don't waste it, Mace, and then the chopper lifted, and I left him there. The diner's ambient noise seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of Mason's confession hanging in the air between them. Catherine's eyes shone with unshed tears. You never told me? How could I? How do you tell the woman you love that you're only alive because your best friend decided your life was worth more than his? So instead you spent the next 40 years trying to save everything that crossed your path, human or animal. Catherine's voice held no accusation, only understanding. Is that what you see in Thunder? Another Tucker? Mason considered the question, the parallel that had been forming in his mind since witnessing Thunder's battle with the python. Maybe, but it's more than that. Watching him with Luna, it's like seeing something pure. No ulterior motives, no questions about worthiness, just devotion. The kind you've never felt you deserved, Catherine said softly. The simple truth of her statement left Mason without words. They finished their meal in contemplative silence. The air between them changed, not healed exactly, but opened in a way it hadn't been for decades. As they drove back to the rehabilitation center, the setting sun bathed the landscape in amber light, transforming ordinary fields and fence lines into something momentarily extraordinary. Mason found himself reaching across the console for Catherine's hand, a gesture so long forgotten that it felt almost new again. I'm glad you came, he said simply. Catherine's fingers intertwined with his. Me too. They arrived back at the center to find Olivia in animated conversation with one of her technicians. The tension in her posture was immediately apparent. What's happened? Mason asked, professional alertness returning instantly. One of our perimeter cameras caught movement on the north fence line, Olivia reported. Someone's scouting the property. Crawford? Can't tell from the footage, but they're being careful, staying just out of clear camera range. Mason checked his watch. Sunset was minutes away, bringing the concealing darkness that would make any approach easier. We need to move Luna and Thunder to a more secure location. The only place more secure than the treatment barn is the isolation unit, Olivia said, and it's too small for both of them. We'd have to separate them. Mason shook his head. Not an option. After what Thunder did to protect her, I'm not going to be the one to keep them apart. Then we secure the barn, Catherine suggested. Limited access points, clear sight lines, we can take shifts watching. Olivia looked at Catherine with newfound respect. That could work. We've got enough staff and volunteers to maintain round-the-clock coverage. As they implemented the security measures, Mason found himself drawn back to the stall where Thunder and Luna rested. In the golden light of early evening, with dust motes dancing in the air between them, the two animals presented a tableau of tranquility that belied the tension surrounding them. Thunder had somehow managed to position himself half-lying against the partition, his massive body angled so that Luna could rest her head against the lower rail and feel his presence. Their breaths had synchronized, rising and falling in perfect unison. The scene radiated a sense of peace that seemed to transcend species, a simple truth about connection and belonging that Mason had spent decades trying to forget. Don't waste it, Mace, Tucker had said. Looking at Thunder and Luna, at Catherine moving purposefully around the barn, at the strange family forming around these extraordinary animals, Mason finally began to understand what his friend had meant. Midnight at the Wildlife Center brought an unnatural stillness, The usual chorus of night creatures had fallen silent, as if the entire ecosystem sensed the tension that had settled over the property. Mason Foster sat in a metal folding chair just inside the barn door, service weapon resting across his lap, a precaution he hadn't needed in years of routine ranger work. From his position, he could see both the main entrance and the recovery stall where Luna and Thunder remained. The barn interior was dimly lit, just enough illumination to monitor the animals without disturbing their rest. Luna's condition had stabilized throughout the evening, her breathing easier, the fever reduced to a low-grade elevation that no longer concerned Olivia. Thunder, permitted to remain close, had finally succumbed to exhaustion, his massive head resting against the partition separating them. Even in sleep, his body remained angled protectively toward Luna. A soft footfall behind him drew Mason's attention. Catherine approached with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to him before taking the seat beside his. "Thought you were getting some rest," Mason said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too quiet. Feels like the calm before a storm." Mason nodded his understanding. After decades of marriage, they'd developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to dangerous situations. His from military and ranger experience, hers from an intuition he'd learned not to discount. "Dr. Reed finally went to lie down," Catherine continued. "I practically had to order her. Woman's been running on fumes for 2 days straight. She's invested in these animals." Mason's gaze drifted back to the sleeping pair. Maybe sees something of herself in them. "Don't we all?" Catherine sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "There's something almost biblical about those two. Like an Old Testament story about faithfulness rewarded." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Didn't figure you for the religious type anymore." "Just because I stopped going to church doesn't mean I stopped believing in things worth believing in." Catherine's eyes met his. "Devotion, sacrifice, second chances." The loaded meaning behind her words hung in the air between them, offering possibilities Mason had long ago stopped considering. Before he could respond, a sharp electronic beep cut through the stillness, one of the perimeter sensors they'd installed that afternoon. Mason was on his feet instantly, coffee forgotten. "North fence line," he said, checking the security tablet. "Same location as before." Catherine stood as well, tension visible in her posture. "Should I wake Dr. Reed?" "Not yet. Could be a false alarm. Deer or wild hogs." But even as he said it, Mason knew better. The timing was too perfect, the location too specific. "Stay here with the animals." "I'll check it out." "Mason," Catherine began, concern evident in her voice. "I'll be careful," he promised, the unfamiliar tenderness in his tone surprising them both. "Keep your phone handy. First sign of trouble, call Harlan." The night air hit him like a physical presence as he stepped outside, hot, humid, heavy with the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Mason moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent decades in the wilderness, each step deliberate, senses hyper-alert to his surroundings. The weight of his service weapon provided cold comfort against the certainty growing in his gut. The north fence line bordered a dense stand of mesquite and scrub oak, perfect cover for someone approaching with ill intent. Mason circled wide, using the outbuildings for concealment as he approached from an unexpected angle. Night vision equipment would have been useful, but he made do with the skills honed through years of tracking wildlife in all conditions. A subtle movement caught his attention, not the wind in the branches, but the deliberate shifting of weight on dry ground. Mason froze, allowing his eyes to adjust further to the darkness. There, crouched beside a fence post, was a human figure methodically working at the wire with cutters. Mason drew his weapon and moved closer, careful to maintain his cover. The figure, male, from the broad-shouldered silhouette, seemed focused entirely on creating an opening in the fence. Behind him, Mason could make out the shadowy outline of a vehicle parked on the service road that ran parallel to the property line. "Texas Parks and Wildlife," Mason called out, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "Put down the cutters and stand up slowly." The figure stiffened, but didn't comply. Instead, in a movement so fluid it spoke of professional training, he rolled away from the fence and drew a handgun of his own. "Don't be stupid, Foster," came the reply, and Mason recognized Victor Crawford's voice. "This doesn't have to get messy." "Breaking onto private property with a weapon seems pretty messy already," Mason countered, maintaining his position behind a storage shed. "What's the play here, Crawford? One aging bull worth risking a felony conviction?" A dry chuckle drifted through the darkness. "That aging bull is worth over $50,000 to the right buyer. More, after what I witnessed. Breeding rights alone would set up a comfortable retirement. For a washed-up vet turned poacher. Seems like a step down from where you started." "Judgmental for a man with your history," Crawford replied, and something in his tone sent a chill down Mason's spine. "Yeah, I did my homework on you, Foster. Vietnam, Special Reconnaissance. That business in the Sonoran Desert back in '87 that never made the official reports." Mason's blood ran cold. The Sonoran incident had been early in his ranger career, a confrontation with wildlife traffickers that had gone sideways, resulting in 2 deaths that were ruled self-defense but had haunted him for decades. The records had been sealed. Only a handful of people knew the details. "You're bluffing," Mason said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I? Let's see. You and Ranger Martinez tracked a shipment of exotic reptiles to a warehouse near the border. Things got heated. 2 traffickers ended up dead, but 1 got away with the evidence. Official report says they drew first, but word is you fired before they cleared leather." The accuracy of Crawford's account confirmed Mason's worst fears. This wasn't just about poaching a valuable bull. Crawford had leverage. "What do you want?" "Simple. Walk away. Go back to the barn. Tell them it was nothing, coyotes, whatever. I take the bull, you keep your reputation. Clean retirement, full pension, no uncomfortable questions about your past indiscretions." Mason's mind raced. Crawford had clearly planned this carefully. The reconnaissance, the background check, the timing of his approach. But something didn't add up. You can't transport a bull that size alone, and you can't separate him from the cow without a fight. What's the real plan here? A pause suggested Mason had hit a nerve. "I've got a team and equipment," Crawford finally said. "Tranquilizers, transport trailer, the works, clean extraction, minimal fuss." "And what happens when Thunder tears your team apart trying to get back to Luna? You saw what he did to that python." "That's my problem to solve, not yours." Mason weighed his options. Engaging in a firefight with Crawford was risky, not just physically dangerous but potentially disastrous for his career if Crawford's allegations came to light. Yet the thought of Thunder being stolen, separated from Luna, and sold to the highest bidder was unacceptable on a level that transcended professional duty. Before Mason could respond, the night exploded into chaos. Floodlights blazed to life around the property perimeter, bathing the area in harsh white light. Crawford cursed, momentarily blinded, and fired a wild shot in Mason's direction. The bullet splintered wood inches from Mason's head. "Texas Parks and Wildlife, drop your weapon," Harlan's voice boomed through a megaphone from the direction of the main building. Additional voices joined the chorus as Olivia's staff and security team converged on the scene. Crawford, realizing he was outmaneuvered, bolted for his vehicle. Mason broke cover to pursue, but the poacher had too much of a head start. The truck's engine roared to life, tires spinning in the loose dirt as it accelerated down the service road. "Hold your fire!" Mason called out as Harlan raised his weapon. Too risky in the dark. The deputy lowered his gun reluctantly. "You okay, Foster? Heard a shot." "I'm fine." Crawford was cutting the fence. "Had it all planned out? Transport equipment, team waiting somewhere nearby?" Mason holstered his weapon, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "How'd you know to turn on the perimeter lights?" "Wasn't us," Harlan admitted. "System activated automatically when someone tried to access the main circuit breaker. Looks like Crawford had a two-pronged approach. Cut power to the barn while breaching the fence line." Mason's respect for Olivia's security measures increased significantly. The veterinarian had clearly anticipated such tactics, probably from hard-won experience with previous attempts on her facility. As they secured the property and repaired the damaged fence section, Catherine approached from the main barn, relief evident in her expression. "I was about to call for backup when the lights came on," she said, her voice steadier than Mason expected. "Thought you might need these." She handed him a set of night vision binoculars he recognized from his equipment bag. "Smart thinking," Mason acknowledged, oddly touched by her foresight. "How are our patients?" "Disturbed by the commotion but settling down. That bull has instincts like a guard dog." He was on his feet the moment the first sensor went off. Back in the barn, they found Olivia examining Luna, her professional demeanor firmly in place, despite having been woken from her first real sleep in days. "No negative impact on her vitals," she reported. "If anything, her readings are stronger than before." Thunder stood at full alert, his massive frame positioned between the barn entrance and Luna's stall. The bull's dark eyes tracked every movement, intelligence and wariness evident in equal measure. When he recognized Mason, something subtle shifted in his posture. Not relaxation exactly, but a slight easing of his defensive stance. "He remembers you helped before," Olivia observed quietly. "Remarkable animal." Mason approached the stall slowly, maintaining eye contact with Thunder. "Crawford won't stop," he said. "Tonight was just reconnaissance. He'll be back with a better plan, more resources." "Then we'll be ready," Olivia replied, determination hardening her voice. "I've dealt with poachers before." "Not like this," Mason countered. "Crawford has personal knowledge about you, about me. Makes it more dangerous." Catherine joined them, her practical nature asserting itself. "Then we change the parameters. Make it harder for him to predict our movements." "How?" Olivia asked. "Move the animals," Catherine suggested. "Not to another part of the facility. He's already scouted that. Somewhere unexpected." Mason considered the idea. "Luna's still recovering. Moving her carries risks. So does keeping her here," Catherine pointed out. "You said yourself, Crawford will be back with a better plan." Olivia's gaze shifted to Luna, clinical assessment visible in her expression. "Her condition has stabilized enough that transportation wouldn't be medically contraindicated, provided we maintain proper monitoring and support." "But where?" Mason asked. "Any official wildlife facility would have the same vulnerabilities." A moment of silence followed as they considered the dilemma. It was Catherine who finally offered the solution, her voice quiet but firm. "Our ranch." Mason turned to her in surprise. "The homestead? Kath, it's not equipped for it has the old stable your grandfather built. Solid construction, single access point, easy to secure, 20 acres of fenced pasture, remote enough that strangers would be immediately noticeable." Catherine's expression challenged him to find fault with her reasoning. "It's been empty for years," Mason objected, though with less conviction. "We've been meaning to sell it." "But we haven't," Catherine countered. "It's still in our name, still maintained enough to be functional. And it's the last place Crawford would think to look for them." Olivia looked between the couple, clearly sensing the deeper currents in their exchange. "Is this property far from here?" "About 40 miles north," Catherine answered. "It was Mason's family ranch. We lived there when we were first married, before moving closer to town for my teaching position." Mason felt the weight of memories pressing against his consciousness. The small ranch house where they'd begun their life together, the stable where Catherine had insisted on keeping 2 rescue horses despite knowing nothing about equine care, the creek where they'd spent summer evenings watching fireflies rise from the grass like earthbound stars. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to remember those early years? "It would need work," he said finally, the token resistance undermined by the consideration already evident in his tone. "I've been keeping it maintained," Catherine admitted, surprising him. "Go out there every couple weeks. Thought we might want it someday when you finally retired." The revelation that Catherine had been preserving this piece of their past, quietly maintaining the possibility of return, struck Mason with unexpected force. How much else had he missed in his single-minded focus on work, on outrunning the ghosts of his past? "It could work," Olivia said, breaking into his thoughts. "If the structure is sound and the property secure, it might be ideal. Off the grid, so to speak." "Crawford has connections," Mason warned. "If he's motivated enough, he'll find them eventually." "But it buys us time," Catherine insisted. "Time for Luna to heal completely. Time for Thunder to be less valuable to him, if that's even possible." A low rumble from Thunder's direction drew their attention. The bull had moved closer to Luna, who had managed to raise her head despite her injuries. Something passed between the animals, a communication beyond human understanding but unmistakable in its intent. "I think they're voting yes," Harlan remarked from the doorway, the unexpected humor breaking the tension. Mason looked at the animals, then at Catherine, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. The determination in her eyes, the practical strength that had attracted him 4 decades earlier and had never actually diminished, only faded from his attention. In that moment, standing in a barn surrounded by unlikely allies, Mason made a decision that had nothing to do with wildlife management protocols and everything to do with honoring what mattered. "All right," he said simply. "We'll take them home." The preparations began immediately, despite the late hour. Olivia gathered medical supplies and monitoring equipment while Mason and Harlan reinforced the transport trailer with additional security features. Catherine departed ahead of them, driving to the ranch to prepare the stable and arrange the most essential accommodations. As dawn approached, casting long shadows across the facility grounds, they were nearly ready for departure. Luna had been carefully loaded onto the reinforced stretcher that would support her during transport, her condition closely monitored by Olivia. Thunder, displaying the same uncanny cooperation he'd shown since the beginning, had allowed himself to be guided to the trailer without resistance, his attention fixed on Luna's stretcher as if memorizing her position. Just before loading began, Mason stepped away briefly, drawn by some instinct to check the perimeter one final time. At the north fence line where Crawford had attempted entry, he found something overlooked in the chaos of the night, a small digital recorder tucked against a fence post. Playing it back revealed ambient sounds of the facility recorded over several days. Staff conversations, animal movements, the regular patterns of activity that would help time a future infiltration. The sophistication of Crawford's surveillance confirmed Mason's concerns. This wasn't an opportunistic poacher. This was a calculated professional, with resources and determination. Moving the animals wasn't just a precaution, it was essential. When Mason returned to the loading area, Olivia was supervising the final preparations. Thunder had already entered the trailer voluntarily, positioning himself in the modified compartment that would allow him visual contact with Luna throughout the journey. The bull's intelligence continued to astonish everyone involved. He seemed to understand not only that they were leaving, but that the humans were helping rather than separating him from Luna. "Found this by the fence," Mason said quietly, showing Olivia the recorder. "Crawford's been studying your operation, learning patterns." Olivia's expression hardened. "Victor always was thorough. It's what made him a good veterinarian before." She let the sentence trail off, the familiar pain of her daughter's loss momentarily surfacing before she pushed it aside. "We're doing the right thing, moving them." "We're doing the right thing," Mason agreed, though the certainty in his voice masked the growing complications he sensed ahead. Crawford knew too much about the facility, about Mason's past, perhaps even about the old ranch. The confrontation had merely been delayed, not avoided. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the convoy prepared to depart. Mason driving the transport trailer with Harlan following in a support vehicle, Olivia riding in the trailer with the animals to monitor Luna's condition during transit. The plan was to take an indirect route, avoiding main roads where possible, maintaining radio silence except for essential communications. Mason climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting mirrors to keep the trailer in constant view. Through the rear window, he could see Thunder standing steady despite the vehicle's movement, dark eyes alert but calm. The bull's unwavering focus on Luna, his absolute dedication to her protection, stirred something profound in Mason's chest. An echo of the man he had once been, the man Catherine had married, before time and trauma had eroded his capacity for such uncomplicated devotion. As they pulled away from the rehabilitation center, Mason caught a final glimpse of the facility in his side mirror. The place where an ordinary wildlife incident had transformed into something that challenged his understanding of both animals and humans. Whatever happened next, he knew with absolute certainty that none of them would ever speak about these events without a sense of wonder and reverence. The convoy turned onto the county road, heading north toward a past Mason had spent decades avoiding and a future none of them could predict. The Foster homestead appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a modest white farmhouse nestled among ancient live oaks, flanked by a weathered red barn and the solid stone stable that had stood for 3 generations. As Mason guided the transport trailer down the winding gravel drive, memories washed over him with almost physical force. Catherine in a sundress hanging laundry on the line, summer evenings on the porch, watching heat lightning dance across distant hills, the simple rhythms of a life he'd gradually abandoned for the numbing predictability of duty. Catherine stood waiting beside the open stable doors, her silver-streaked hair caught in the morning light. She'd changed into work clothes, faded jeans, boots, a chambray shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, and somehow looked more at home than Mason had seen her in years. As the vehicles came to a stop in the yard, Mason was struck by the realization that while he'd been running from the past, Catherine had been quietly preserving it. "Got everything ready?" she called as Mason climbed down from the cab. "Fresh straw, water troughs filled, temporary partitions set up like Dr. Reed requested." Mason surveyed the property with a ranger's eye for security. The homestead sat in a shallow valley, accessible only by the single gravel road they'd traveled. Dense stands of mesquite and oak provided natural barriers on 3 sides, while the open pasture land to the south offered clear sight lines that would make approach difficult without detection. It wasn't impenetrable, but it offered significant advantages over the rehabilitation center's more accessible location. "Place looks good," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Better than I remembered." "Amazing what regular maintenance can do," Catherine replied, a gentle rebuke in her tone. "Come see what I've done with the stable." The stone structure had been his grandfather's pride, built in the 1930s with limestone quarried from the property itself, designed to withstand the tornadoes and summer storms that periodically swept across the Texas landscape. Inside, Catherine had transformed the space into a functional recovery area. The original horse stalls had been modified with lowered partitions that would allow Thunder and Luna visual contact while providing necessary separation for Luna's continued treatment. "This is impressive," Olivia said, joining them after her initial examination of Luna in the trailer. "Better than many professional facilities I've worked with." Catherine was always good at making something from nothing, Mason said, the compliment emerging more naturally than he expected. The process of transferring Luna from the trailer to the stable presented the first major challenge. The cow's condition remained stable but fragile, and any excessive movement risked exacerbating her injuries. Thunder's behavior complicated matters further. The bull grew increasingly agitated as strangers approached Luna's stretcher, his protective instincts clearly at war with the cooperation he'd shown thus far. "He's reaching his limit," Olivia warned as Thunder pawed the trailer floor, muscles tensing beneath his silver-gray hide. Too many people, too much activity around her. Mason stepped forward, placing himself directly in Thunder's line of sight. "Everyone back off," he ordered quietly. "Give him space." The team retreated, leaving only Mason near the trailer's open door. Thunder's dark eyes fixed on him, not aggressive, but intensely evaluative. Mason held the gaze, allowing the bull to see him fully, to recognize him as the same human who had helped during the python attack. "I know you're worried about her," Mason said, keeping his voice low and steady. "We're trying to help. She needs to be inside where she can rest properly." Whether it was Mason's tone, his steady presence, or some deeper understanding, Thunder's posture gradually relaxed. When Mason stepped back and gestured toward the stable, the bull seemed to comprehend the invitation. With deliberate care, Thunder exited the trailer and followed as Luna's stretcher was carried toward the stable, maintaining perfect position to watch every movement without interfering. Inside the modified stable, Luna was gently transferred to a bed of fresh straw piled thick enough to provide cushioning for her injured body. Olivia worked efficiently, connecting monitoring equipment and administering medications, while Thunder observed from just outside the stall. Once Luna was settled, the bull entered the adjacent space and immediately positioned himself against the lowered partition, as close to her as the configuration allowed. "It's like he's done this before," Harlan remarked, watching Thunder's methodical movements. "Like he understands exactly what we're trying to do." "Maybe he does," Catherine said simply. With Luna and Thunder secured in the stable, the team gathered in the farmhouse kitchen to assess their situation. The room bore Catherine's touch, clean and functional despite years of limited use, with fresh coffee brewing and simple provisions laid out on the worn oak table that had belonged to Mason's mother. "Crawford will figure out they're gone by now," Mason said, accepting a mug of coffee from Catherine. "Question is, how long before he starts looking beyond the obvious locations?" "The facility security system shows no breaches since we left," Olivia reported, checking her phone. "My staff is maintaining normal routines, giving the impression that treatment is ongoing in the isolation wing." "That won't fool him for long," Mason warned. "Man did his homework." "He'll notice the patterns are off." Harlan nodded in agreement. "I've got deputies making regular drive-bys at the center, and we've put out an APB on Crawford's vehicle. But without evidence of an actual crime beyond trespassing, we can't allocate resources to a formal search." The limitations of their situation hung heavily in the air. They had moved the animals without official authorization, operating in a gray area that Mason's reputation and Olivia's professional standing might justify if questioned, but which nonetheless left them vulnerable. "I should get back to the center," Olivia said reluctantly. "My absence will be the most obvious tell that something's changed. If I maintain visible presence there, it might buy us more time." "I'll drive you," Harlan offered. "Need to check in at the station anyway, see if we've got anything on Crawford's movements." Their departure left Mason and Catherine alone at the homestead, a circumstance that would have felt awkward days earlier but now carried a strange sense of rightness, as if they were settling back into roles long abandoned but not forgotten. "I'll stay with the animals," Mason said, rising from the table. "You should rest. It's been a long night." Catherine shook her head. "I'll rest when you do. We're in this together now." The simple declaration, "We're in this together," echoed in Mason's mind as they established a watch routine, taking turns monitoring the stable and patrolling the property perimeter. The summer heat built as morning gave way to afternoon, the Texas sun beating down with relentless intensity. Inside the stone stable, however, the temperature remained bearable, the thick walls providing natural insulation against the worst of the day's warmth. During his watch, Mason found himself drawn to the unlikely pair they had brought into their lives. Thunder maintained his vigilant position beside Luna, occasionally making the soft, rumbling sound they had come to recognize as his way of communicating with her. Luna's condition continued to improve incrementally. She managed to lift her head for longer periods, and her breathing grew steadier with each passing hour. "You're quite a pair," Mason said aloud, settling onto a wooden stool near the stalls. "Never seen anything like it in 30 years of wildlife work." Thunder's ears flicked in his direction, acknowledging his presence without shifting focus from Luna. "Catherine thinks you understand everything we're saying," Mason continued, surprising himself with the one-sided conversation. "Maybe she's right. She usually is, about the important things." As evening approached, Catherine joined him in the stable, bringing a simple dinner of sandwiches and iced tea. They ate in companionable silence, the peaceful sounds of the animals' breathing creating an atmosphere of unexpected tranquility. "I forgot how quiet it is out here," Mason said finally. "How different from town." Catherine nodded, her gaze drifting to the open stable door where the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber. "Remember when we first moved in? You said you'd never sleep without city noise again, but within a week you couldn't stand to be anywhere else." The memory surfaced with surprising clarity, their first night in the farmhouse, the overwhelming silence that had triggered his Vietnam hypervigilance, Catherine holding him through the worst of the panic attacks. "You got me through that," he acknowledged. "Through a lot of things." "We got each other through," she corrected gently. "That's what marriage is supposed to be." Before Mason could respond, a sudden movement from Luna's stall caught their attention. The cow was struggling to rise, her legs trembling with the effort. Thunder immediately became alert, making urgent sounds unlike his usual rumbles. "Something's wrong," Catherine said, already moving toward the stalls. Mason followed quickly, concern overriding caution as he entered Luna's space. The cow's sides heaved with labored breathing, her eyes wide with what could only be described as distress. Thunder paced in the adjacent stall, his agitation growing with each moment. "Call Olivia," Mason directed, kneeling beside Luna to check the monitoring equipment. "Her pulse is elevated, respiration irregular." Catherine hurried to retrieve her phone, but before she could dial, Luna collapsed back onto the straw, a low moan escaping her. Thunder's response was immediate and heart-wrenching, a sound so filled with anguish that it seemed to transcend species, a universal cry of fear for a loved one. Mason's hands moved over Luna's body, seeking the source of her distress, drawing on long-forgotten training from his early days with parks and wildlife. When his fingers detected unusual heat and swelling along her left side, understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. "Internal bleeding," he said as Catherine returned. "The fractures must have shifted, nicked something inside." "Olivia's on her way, but it's at least 40 minutes from the center," Catherine reported, fear evident in her voice. "Luna might not have 40 minutes, Mason said grimly. "We need to stabilize her now." What followed was a desperate improvisation. Drawing on his field medicine training and Catherine's practical knowledge, Mason created a makeshift pressure bandage to slow the bleeding while Catherine administered the emergency medications Olivia had left for them, following the veterinarian's hurried instructions over the phone. Throughout their efforts, Thunder remained in extraordinary distress. The bull paced, bellowed, occasionally drove his head against the partition in what seemed like frustrated attempts to reach Luna. His behavior confirmed what they had already come to believe. that his connection to Luna transcended normal animal behavior, approaching something that in humans would unquestionably be called love. "Stay with us, girl," Mason murmured, maintaining pressure on Luna's side while monitoring her increasingly erratic pulse. "Your friend here isn't ready to let you go, and neither are we." The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Luna's condition continued to deteriorate despite their best efforts. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes dulling as shock took hold. Thunder's distress escalated in direct proportion to Luna's decline, his massive body now hurling itself against the partition with such force that the entire stable seemed to shake. "He knows," Catherine whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. "He knows she's slipping away." The realization struck Mason with physical force. Thunder wasn't just reacting to Luna's distress, he understood the severity of her condition. The bull was watching his companion die, unable to reach her, prevented from being at her side in her final moments by the very barriers they had erected to protect her. In that moment, Mason made a decision that defied every safety protocol, every regulation he'd enforced throughout his career. "Help me move this partition," he said to Catherine. "Now." Catherine's eyes widened. "Mason, if he charges in his current state—" "He won't," Mason said with a certainty he couldn't explain. "He just wants to be with her. Wouldn't you want the same?" Together they removed the bolts, securing the temporary partition. As the barrier came away, Thunder immediately stilled, his frantic energy transforming into focused intensity. With astonishing gentleness, the massive bull entered Luna's space, careful not to disturb the medical equipment or step on her injured body. He lowered himself to the straw beside her with delicate precision, positioning his massive frame so that Luna's head rested against his shoulder. The change in Luna was immediate and remarkable. Her breathing, though still labored, steadied slightly. Her dulling eyes seemed to regain a spark of awareness as Thunder made the soft, rumbling sound that had become so familiar. It wasn't recovery. Mason had seen enough dying animals to recognize the approaching end. But it was comfort, connection, a easing of distress that no medication could have provided. "They need privacy," Catherine said softly, tugging at Mason's arm. "Let's wait outside." They stepped out of the stable into the gathering twilight, emotions too complex for words passing between them. In the distance they could hear the approaching siren of Olivia's vehicle, but both knew it would arrive too late for anything but confirmation. "I've never seen anything like that," Mason said finally, voice rough with emotion. "In all my years with animals, I've never—" "It's love, Mason," Catherine said simply. "No different from what we feel, maybe purer, without all our human complications." The stark truth of her statement resonated deeply. Mason thought of Tucker, of the sacrifice his friend had made without hesitation. He thought of his marriage to Catherine, the devotion he had taken for granted, the connection he had allowed to fade through neglect rather than absence of feeling. And he thought of Thunder, who had never questioned his instinct to protect Luna, never calculated the personal cost, never held back any part of himself. Olivia's vehicle skidded to a stop in the yard, the veterinarian emerging with medical bag in hand before the dust had settled. "How is she?" she called, already moving toward the stable. "Going," Mason answered simply, "but not alone." The word choice wasn't lost on Olivia. Her steps slowed as understanding dawned. "You let him in with her?" "It was the right thing to do," Catherine affirmed. "See for yourself." Inside the stable, they found a scene of profound tranquility that belied the crisis of moments before. Thunder lay curled protectively around Luna's failing body, his massive head resting gently beside hers. Luna's breathing had slowed to shallow, widely spaced inhales, but the panic had left her eyes, replaced by what Mason could only interpret as peace. Olivia stood motionless in the doorway, professional detachment crumbling in the face of what lay before her. "I've never—" she began, then stopped, words failing her. "We know," Catherine said gently. "None of us have." For nearly an hour, they maintained a quiet vigil as Luna's life ebbed away. Thunder remained perfectly still except for the occasional soft sound he made against her ear, a communication none of them could translate, but all understood. When the end finally came, a last shuddering breath, a stillness that carried finality, Thunder's reaction defied everything Mason thought he knew about animal behavior. The bull didn't rise immediately, didn't flee the presence of death as instinct should have dictated. Instead, he remained beside Luna, making a new sound, a low, keening vibration that carried such unmistakable grief that tears sprang to Catherine's eyes. Olivia turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, while Mason stood frozen, witnessing something he had no framework to process. "He's mourning her," Catherine whispered. "Actually mourning." When Thunder finally rose, it was with a deliberate dignity that struck Mason as almost ceremonial. The bull stood over Luna's body for several long moments, then gently nuzzled her still form one last time before backing away, allowing the humans to approach. Olivia moved forward mechanically, her medical training asserting itself as she confirmed what they already knew. "She's gone," she said unnecessarily. "The internal bleeding was too severe. Even if I'd been here, I couldn't have saved her." The words were meant to comfort, but they fell flat in the face of Thunder's palpable grief. The bull had moved to the far corner of the stable, his massive head lowered, his entire posture radiating a sorrow so profound it seemed to fill the space like a physical presence. "What do we do now?" Catherine asked, the practical question masking deeper concerns. Mason looked at Thunder, at the magnificent animal now bereft of the companion he had fought so desperately to protect. "We honor her," he said finally, "and we protect him more than ever." As the full darkness of night settled over the homestead, they worked together to prepare Luna's body for removal. Thunder watched from his corner, making no move to interfere but missing nothing. When they began to move her, however, the bull stepped forward with clear purpose, positioning himself beside the makeshift stretcher. "He wants to follow her," Mason realized aloud, "to see where she's going." In silent agreement, they allowed Thunder to accompany them as they carried Luna's body to a small rise behind the stable, a spot Catherine identified as appropriate for burial, where wildflowers bloomed in spring and the view stretched across the valley to distant hills. Throughout the improvised ceremony that followed, Thunder maintained a dignified presence, his grief evident but controlled, his dark eyes following every movement of Luna's body until the earth finally covered her from view. When it was done, when the last shovelful of soil had been patted into place and Olivia had spoken a few halting words of farewell, Thunder approached the grave site. With infinite gentleness, the bull lowered his massive head to the freshly turned earth, remaining motionless for several long moments before turning away. "I should sedate him," Olivia said quietly as they watched Thunder walk back toward the stable. The shock, the grief, it could trigger unpredictable behavior. Mason shook his head firmly. "No, he deserves to feel it, to process it in his own way." "That's not how we typically handle livestock in distress," Olivia objected, though without conviction. "Nothing about this situation has been typical," Catherine pointed out. "He's earned the right to grieve however he needs to." As they returned to the stable, Mason was struck by the transformation that had occurred in Thunder's demeanor. The bull had always projected strength and purpose, but now there was something more, a gravity, a stillness that spoke of profound loss, but also of endurance. He had positioned himself in the stall he had shared with Luna, facing the door as if standing guard over memories only he could access. "We'll take shifts watching him tonight," Mason decided, "just to be safe." But as the hours passed, it became clear that Thunder presented no danger to himself or others. The bull maintained his quiet vigilance, occasionally making the soft, keening sound they had come to recognize as his expression of grief, but otherwise remaining calm and composed. By midnight, even Olivia had to admit that sedation seemed unnecessary. "I've never seen an animal process loss like this," she confessed as they gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, voices low despite the distance from the stable. "It's as if he's moving through stages of grief just like a human would." "Maybe the line between human and animal emotion isn't as clear as we like to think," Catherine suggested. Mason found himself nodding in agreement, remembering Tucker again, the way his friend had faced death with the same dignity Thunder now displayed. "Whatever it is, we owe him protection. Crawford's still out there, and Thunder's more vulnerable now than ever." The mention of Victor Crawford darkened the mood considerably. In the crisis of Luna's decline and death, they had momentarily forgotten the external threat that had driven them to the homestead in the first place. "Victor won't stop," Olivia said, a hardness entering her voice that Mason hadn't heard before. "Especially now that he's invested time and resources. He's not the type to walk away from a potential payday." "Then we make sure he doesn't find what he's looking for," Mason stated simply, the ranger's determination reasserting itself. "We keep Thunder safe, whatever it takes." As Catherine and Olivia finally retired to get some rest, Mason took the first watch, settling onto the stable's wooden bench with his service weapon across his knees. The night wrapped around the homestead like a protective blanket, stars brilliant in the clear Texas sky. In the adjacent stall, Thunder maintained his quiet vigil, occasionally shifting position but never truly settling. "I'm sorry about Luna," Mason said into the darkness, not expecting a response but feeling compelled to acknowledge the bull's loss. "We did everything we could." Thunder's massive head turned slightly in his direction, dark eyes reflecting the minimal light from the battery lantern. For a moment, Mason could have sworn he saw understanding there, not just animal intelligence, but a depth of comprehension that transcended species. "We're going to keep you safe," Mason promised. "No matter what Crawford tries, he's not getting anywhere near you." As the words left his mouth, a cold certainty settled in Mason's gut. The confrontation with Crawford was inevitable now, perhaps had been from the moment they'd witnessed Thunder's extraordinary behavior. The only questions remaining were when and where it would occur, and whether they would be prepared when it did. Dawn broke over the Foster homestead with deceptive serenity, golden light spilling across the weathered buildings and dew-laden grass. Mason stood on the farmhouse porch, coffee mug cooling in his hand as he surveyed the property with the heightened awareness of a man anticipating trouble. The night had passed without incident, but the reprieve felt temporary, a held breath before the inevitable exhale of confrontation. Inside the stone stable, Thunder had finally succumbed to exhaustion. His massive frame settled onto the straw in a position that left him facing Luna's now empty stall. Even in sleep, the bull maintained a dignified posture, his grief evident in the occasional soft sounds that escaped him. Olivia had checked on him hourly throughout the night, marveling at the complexity of his emotional response while monitoring for signs of physical decline. "Animals aren't supposed to mourn like this," she'd whispered during the pre-dawn check. "Not with this awareness." But Thunder defied categorization, just as his relationship with Luna had transcended conventional understanding of animal behavior. In the harsh light of morning, with Luna gone, the bull's extraordinary nature seemed even more pronounced, and more valuable to someone like Victor Crawford. Catherine emerged from the farmhouse, 2 fresh mugs of coffee in hand. She'd aged overnight, fine lines around her eyes deepening with fatigue, yet there was a resolute strength in her bearing that reminded Mason of their early years together. "Anything?" she asked, handing him a steaming mug to replace his cold one. Mason shook his head. Quiet night. Too quiet, maybe. You still think he'll come? It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. Crawford's invested too much. Professional pride, if nothing else. And now Luna's gone and Thunder's behavior is even more remarkable, Catherine finished. Grief response in livestock isn't exactly common. Mason nodded, the familiar ease of their thought patterns aligning after so many years apart, catching him by surprise. We need to move him again. Property's too isolated, too hard to defend if Crawford brings numbers. Where would we take him? The rehabilitation center's compromised and any official facility would require paperwork, explanations. Before Mason could respond, Olivia joined them on the porch, medical bag in hand. The veterinarian looked exhausted, the strain of the past days etched into the lines of her face. "How is he?" Catherine asked. "Physically stable, refusing food, but that's to be expected under the circumstances." Olivia's clinical tone belied the emotion visible in her eyes. "Emotionally, I don't have a framework for what he's experiencing." We don't have adequate language to describe animal grief, especially at this level of complexity. Mason's gaze drifted to the stable where Thunder was now visible in the doorway, his massive silhouette outlined against the interior darkness. The bull had positioned himself to watch the humans, his posture alert but not agitated. "He's keeping track of us," Mason observed, "making sure we don't disappear, too." The insight struck Olivia with visible force. Of course, he's lost Luna. Now he's monitoring the remaining members of his makeshift herd. She shook her head in wonder. The psychological sophistication required for that? Their contemplation was interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. Tires on gravel, engine straining slightly on the incline leading to the homestead. Mason tensed immediately, hand moving instinctively to his service weapon. "Expecting anyone?" he asked Catherine, already knowing the answer. "No." "Harlan would have called first." Mason moved swiftly, tactical training taking over as he positioned himself with clear sight lines to the access road while maintaining cover behind a porch column. "Get inside," he directed the women. "If it's Crawford—" "It's not," Olivia interrupted, peering down the drive. "It's a Parks and Wildlife vehicle. Official markings." The government SUV crested the hill and rolled to a stop in the yard, dust settling around its wheels as the engine cut off. The driver's door opened to reveal Regional Director Margaret Blackwood, Mason's direct supervisor and the person responsible for processing his retirement paperwork. "Well, hell," Mason muttered, holstering his weapon. Margaret's presence complicated an already complex situation. As head of regional operations, she had the authority to demand explanations for their unauthorized animal transport, and, if unsatisfied, to initiate disciplinary action against both Mason and Olivia. "Director Blackwood," Mason acknowledged as the woman approached, her crisp uniform and ramrod posture projecting authority despite her small stature. At 60, Margaret was a legend in the department. A pioneer who had broken barriers for women in wildlife management and developed a reputation for uncompromising standards. "Foster," she replied coolly. "Care to explain why you've got a bull involved in an active investigation hidden on your private property instead of in approved wildlife facilities?" "It's a long story, ma'am." "I've got time." Margaret's gaze shifted to Olivia. "Dr. Reed, surprised to see you mixed up in this. Thought you ran a reputable operation." "I do," Olivia replied, professional dignity asserting itself despite her exhaustion. "Which is why I agreed to this unorthodox arrangement. The circumstances are exceptional." Margaret's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Exceptional enough to justify removing evidence from a python attack investigation. To transport a bull without proper authorization, to involve civilians?" Her gaze cut to Catherine, who met it without flinching. Yes, Mason said simply. If you'll allow me to explain, I believe you'll agree. What followed was a concise but comprehensive recounting of the past day's events. Thunder's extraordinary behavior during and after the Python attack, Crawford's surveillance and attempted break-in, Luna's condition and ultimate death, and the bull's remarkable grief response. Throughout the explanation, Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mason caught flickers of surprise at certain details. "And you believe this Victor Crawford intends to steal the bull for sale to private exotic game interests?" she asked when Mason finished. "I know he does." "He as much as admitted it during our confrontation at the rehabilitation center." Margaret nodded thoughtfully, then surprised them all by asking, "May I see the animal?" They led her to the stable, maintaining a respectful distance from Thunder, who watched their approach with intelligent wariness. The bull had positioned himself in what Mason had come to recognize as his protective stance, head slightly lowered, powerful shoulders squared, every line of his massive body communicating readiness. "Impressive specimen," Margaret observed dispassionately. "Brahmin crossbreed?" "Pure Brahmin, we believe," Olivia replied. "Distinguished by unusually advanced cognitive and emotional capabilities." As if understanding he was being discussed, Thunder shifted his position slightly, dark eyes fixing on Margaret with unsettling intensity. The regional director held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between human and animal. "I see what you mean," she said finally, turning back to Mason. "Not typical bovine behavior by any standard." "No, ma'am." Margaret sighed, the sound carrying the weight of bureaucratic complications to come. "You've put me in a difficult position, Foster. Technically, I should order the bull transferred to official facilities immediately, file reports on the unauthorized transport, and initiate reviews of both your conduct and Dr. Reed's." Mason nodded, accepting the reality of potential consequences. "I understand, ma'am. I'll take full responsibility. Dr. Reed was acting under my direction." "That's not entirely accurate," Olivia began to object, but Margaret waved her off. "Save it. I haven't finished." The director's gaze returned to Thunder, something softening almost imperceptibly in her expression. "What I should do and what I'm going to do are different matters." "I didn't drive out here at dawn to file paperwork." Catherine stepped forward, confusion evident in her voice. "I don't understand. How did you even know we were here?" A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "Deputy Harlan called me directly last night, said I needed to see something remarkable before making any decisions about Mason's retirement or this situation." She turned to Mason. "He seems to think quite highly of you, Foster. Says you're the best ranger he's worked with, retirement papers or not." The unexpected support from Harlan caught Mason off guard. The deputy had always been professional, but reserved in their working relationship. "What I'm seeing here," Margaret continued, gesturing toward Thunder, "is indeed remarkable. Scientifically significant, even. The kind of behavioral anomaly that merits proper study rather than bureaucratic interference." She straightened, decision apparently made. "Here's how we're going to handle this. The bull stays here for now under Joint Parks and Wildlife and Rehabilitation Center supervision. We'll classify it as an extended field study of trauma response in bovines." "And Crawford?" Mason asked, not entirely trusting this unexpected reprieve. "I'll have a conversation with local law enforcement about increased patrols in the area. Beyond that," Margaret's expression hardened. "I understand you have history with this individual, Dr. Reed. Personal history." Olivia stiffened. "He's my brother, and responsible for my daughter's death." "I'm aware of the accident," Margaret said, surprising them again with her level of information. "What concerns me is his current activities. If he's engaged in wildlife trafficking, as you suspect, that falls under our jurisdiction." "He is," Mason confirmed. We found surveillance equipment at the rehabilitation center. He's organized, prepared, and has resources. Margaret nodded grimly. Then we'll handle him appropriately when the time comes. In the meantime, I'm assigning additional rangers to rotate through this location, discreetly, of course. We'll establish a presence without drawing attention. The thoroughness of Margaret's response suggested she'd given the matter more thought than her surprise appearance indicated. Mason found himself wondering exactly how much Harlan had told her and how long she'd been aware of the situation before deciding to intervene. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "By all rights, I should be turning in my badge right now." Margaret studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because in 40 years of wildlife management, I've learned to trust when something matters beyond regulations. This," she gestured toward Thunder, "matters. And because you were right to protect him, even if your methods were unorthodox." With that, the director departed, leaving behind instructions for the security protocols she expected them to implement, and a promise to return the following day with additional personnel. As her vehicle disappeared down the gravel drive, Mason found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about bureaucratic leadership. "Well," Catherine said into the stunned silence that followed, "that wasn't what I expected." "Margaret always did have more depth than people gave her credit for," Mason mused. "Still, this level of accommodation isn't typical." Olivia shook her head, equally puzzled. "Something else is happening here." She knew too much, responded too quickly. Before they could explore the question further, a low sound from the stable drew their attention. Thunder had moved to the doorway again, his massive frame silhouetted against the interior darkness. The bull's posture had changed subtly, less guarded, more alert, as if sensing the shift in circumstances. "He knows something's different," Catherine observed. "The energy's changed." Mason approached the stable slowly, maintaining eye contact with Thunder. The bull watched his advance without aggression, dark eyes evaluating his approach with the same uncanny intelligence that had marked all their interactions. "We've got help now," Mason said quietly, not feeling foolish for speaking directly to the animal. "More people to keep you safe." Thunder's response was a soft rumble. Not the grief sound they had come to recognize, but something new, something that almost resembled acknowledgement. The bull stepped fully into the morning light, his silver-gray coat catching the sun as he moved with deliberate dignity to the water trough Catherine had filled earlier. "He's drinking," Olivia noted with professional approval. "First time since Luna died." "That's a positive sign." The small victory lightened the mood considerably. As they returned to the farmhouse to formulate plans based on Margaret's directives, Mason found himself reflecting on the strange chain of events that had led them to this point. What had begun as a routine wildlife incident had evolved into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness, professional duty, and personal redemption. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts, her hand finding his as they walked. "Quite a way to start retirement," she said, gentle humor in her voice. "Who said anything about retirement?" Mason replied, surprising himself with the response. "Paperwork's still unsigned." The possibility hung in the air between them that this extraordinary situation might represent not an end to his career, but a transformation of it. Before Catherine could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the moment. This time, however, the distinctive rumble of Harlan's truck dispelled immediate concerns. The deputy emerged from his vehicle with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who knows he's overstepped boundaries but doesn't regret it. "Director Blackwood been by yet?" he asked without preamble. "Just left," Mason confirmed. "Want to tell me why you went over my head to my boss?" Harlan had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Thought you might need backup of the administrative kind. Blackwood's always had respect for you, even if she doesn't show it. Figured she'd want to see this situation firsthand before making any decisions." "Could have warned me," Mason grumbled. though without real heat. Nearly gave me a heart attack seeing her pull up. Wouldn't have been authentic that way, Harlan said with the ghost of a smile. Besides, brought you something that might make up for it. He reached into his truck and withdrew a thick file folder. Everything we've got on Victor Crawford's movements over the past 6 months. Turns out your python wasn't his first illegal animal transaction. The revelation sent a chill down Mason's spine. He's been operating in the area that long? Harlan nodded grimly. Pattern suggests he's supplying high-end exotic game ranches with unusual specimens, animals with unique coloration, rare genetic traits, or exceptional behavioral characteristics, Olivia finished, the implication clear. Like thunder. The file Harlan provided painted a disturbing picture of Victor Crawford's operation. What had initially seemed like opportunistic poaching was revealed as a sophisticated trafficking network, with connections to private hunting reserves across Texas and beyond. Crawford himself remained the central figure, his veterinary background providing expertise in animal selection, sedation, and transport. He's got a system, Mason observed as they reviewed the documents at the kitchen table. Identifies high-value targets, conducts extensive surveillance, creates diversions when necessary, then executes precise extractions. The python, Catherine said suddenly. It wasn't just a random attack. Crawford released it deliberately, near where Luna was likely to be. Olivia paled at the realization, which means he was studying both animals beforehand, knew their patterns, their relationship. He created a situation designed to showcase Thunder's protective behavior, making him more valuable, Mason concluded grimly. The ultimate trophy, not just a magnificent bull, but one with demonstrated protective instincts. The kind of story that would appeal to wealthy clients who want something unique. The calculated cruelty of it, using Luna as bait, engineering a situation that put her life at risk simply to test Thunder's response, filled Mason with cold fury. This wasn't just poaching, it was a deliberate exploitation of the very bond that had moved them all so deeply. There's more, Harlan said, turning to a section deeper in the file. Crawford's not working alone. He's got at least 3 associates with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Professional extraction team. The stakes had just risen considerably. One poacher, even one as calculated as Crawford, might be manageable. A team of professionals with tactical training presented an entirely different level of threat. We need to accelerate the security measures, Mason decided. I want motion sensors on every approach, cameras with night vision capability, regular patrols. Already in progress, Harlan assured him. Director Blackwood authorized emergency resources. First team arrives this afternoon to set up equipment. The swift response was reassuring, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a critical juncture. Crawford had invested too much time and resources to simply walk away, especially now that he knew Thunder's location had changed. The confrontation was coming. It was only a matter of when and how. As the day progressed, the homestead was transformed into a secure compound. Parks and wildlife rangers installed surveillance equipment at strategic points around the property, while Harlan coordinated with local law enforcement to establish regular patrols of the access road. Thunder observed the increased activity with watchful attention, his behavior displaying none of the agitation they might have expected from a typical bull. Instead, he seemed to understand that the preparations were for his protection, occasionally emerging from the stable to observe before returning to his vigil. By late afternoon, a sense of cautious optimism had begun to take hold. The security measures were substantial, the personnel experienced, the threat understood. Even Olivia, who had remained tense and withdrawn since the revelations about her brother's deliberate role in the python attack, allowed herself to relax slightly. "We've done everything possible," she acknowledged as they gathered for a simple dinner in the farmhouse kitchen. "The rest is up to vigilance and luck." "And Thunder himself," Catherine added. "He's proven more aware than any of us expected. He'll alert us if something's wrong." As if summoned by their discussion, a distinct bellowing sound emerged from the direction of the stable. Not Thunder's grief call or his rumbling communication, but something sharper, more urgent. Mason was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his weapon as he strode toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered. But Catherine and Olivia were already following, concern overriding caution. Outside, the Texas twilight had painted the landscape in deepening blues and purples, the first stars appearing in the eastern sky. Thunder stood in the stable doorway, massive head raised, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. Every line of his powerful body communicated alertness, his dark eyes fixed on the distant tree line that marked the property's northern boundary. "Something's got his attention," Mason said quietly, drawing his weapon. "Harlan, north perimeter check." The deputy nodded, moving toward his vehicle to radio the rangers patrolling that section. Before he could reach it, however, a sharp crack split the evening quiet, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. Simultaneously, the dirt at Thunder's feet erupted in a small explosion of dust. "Sniper!" Mason shouted, already moving toward Thunder with reckless disregard for his own safety. "Get him inside!" The bull, displaying once again an understanding that defied conventional animal behavior, retreated into the stable without hesitation. Catherine and Olivia followed, keeping low as Mason had taught them, while Harlan took cover behind his truck, service weapon drawn as he scanned the tree line. "Can't see the shooter," he called to Mason. "Must be using a hide." Another shot rang out, this one striking the stable wall several feet above Thunder's position. The message was clear. The shooter could hit the bull if desired, but was deliberately missing, a warning or demonstration rather than an actual attempt. "Crawford," Olivia said, the name emerging as both statement and curse. "This is his style, proving he can reach us even with all our precautions." Mason's mind raced through options. The shooter had the advantage of concealment and elevation, making direct confrontation dangerous. Waiting for backup was the tactically sound choice, but it would mean remaining passive while Crawford dictated the terms of engagement. Before he could decide, Thunder moved with unexpected purpose toward the rear of the stable, his massive body angling toward the small door that led to the fenced paddock beyond. The bull's intention was clear. He was removing himself from the line of fire, seeking safer ground away from the vulnerable humans. "He's protecting us," Catherine realized aloud, wonder cutting through her fear, drawing the threat away. The insight crystallized Mason's decision. He would not allow Thunder to sacrifice himself, would not permit Crawford to claim victory after all they had witnessed. With silent signals honed through decades of fieldwork, he directed Harlan to circle wide while he approached the tree line from the opposite direction. Catherine and Olivia would remain with Thunder, securing the stable against any approach. As Mason moved through the gathering darkness, memories of Vietnam resurfaced with startling clarity. The heightened awareness, the calculated risk assessment, the absolute focus on the objective. He had been a different man then, younger and harder, shaped by a conflict that had left permanent scars on his psyche. Now, decades later, he found himself drawing on those same skills to protect a bull who had demonstrated more humanity than many people he'd encountered. The irony wasn't lost on him. The north tree line loomed ahead, dense shadows concealing potential threats. Mason moved with practiced stealth, using natural cover and the deepening twilight to mask his approach. From the corner of his eye, he could see Harlan making similar progress from the western approach, the deputy's training evident in his disciplined movements. A flicker of movement caught Mason's attention, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows, moving with purpose toward a position with clearer sightlines to the stable. The figure carried a rifle with a distinctive scope, confirming Mason's suspicions about the sniper's equipment. With cold precision, Mason adjusted his position, closing the distance while maintaining concealment. 20 yards, 15-10. Close enough now to identify the figure as male, medium build, dressed in tactical gear that suggested professional training. Not Crawford himself, but one of his associates, the extraction team Harlan had warned about. Mason drew a deep breath, centering himself for what came next. "Texas Parks and Wildlife," he called out, his voice carrying the full weight of official authority. "Drop your weapon and put your hands where I can see them." The figure froze momentarily, then made a critical miscalculation. Instead of surrendering, he swung the rifle toward Mason's position with trained efficiency. Mason fired once, the sound explosive in the evening quiet. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder, the rifle falling harmlessly beside him. "Don't move," Mason ordered, approaching with weapons still trained on the wounded man. "Next one won't be a shoulder shot." As he secured the suspect, disarming him and applying basic first aid to the wound, Mason became aware of movement deeper in the tree line, multiple figures retreating hastily. Crawford's team abandoning their position now that the advantage of surprise was lost. Harlan appeared beside him, weapon ready as he surveyed the scene. "Got one," he observed unnecessarily. "Others?" "At least 2 more, heading east," Mason replied, securing the wounded man's hands with zip ties. "Crawford?" "Can't confirm. Might have been coordinating remotely." The suspect, a hard-faced man in his 40s with the lean build of former military, maintained sullen silence as they treated his wound and transported him to Harlan's vehicle. Only when they reached the farmyard, where Catherine and Olivia waited anxiously by the stable, did he finally speak. "Crawford said the old ranger was past his prime," he muttered, grimacing as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. "Said you'd lost your edge." "Crawford was wrong about a lot of things," Mason replied evenly. "Who else is on the team?" The man's expression closed. "Lawyer," he said simply. Mason recognized the response, the default position of a professional who knew his rights and the value of silence. Further questioning would yield nothing without formal interrogation procedures. As Harlan departed with the prisoner, arrangements made for both medical treatment and official booking, Mason turned his attention to securing the homestead against further attempts. The failed extraction would not deter Crawford. If anything, it would intensify his determination. The man had now invested significant resources and risked legal exposure. His options were narrowing to desperate measures. Inside the stable, Thunder had returned to his position of watchful alertness, dark eyes tracking every movement as the humans implemented additional security protocols. The bull's behavior continued to defy conventional understanding, not simply intelligent but strategic, as if he comprehended the nature of the threat and his own role in the unfolding conflict. "He knew," Catherine said quietly, as they checked the stable's reinforced doors. "Before any of us, he sensed something was wrong." Mason nodded, the truth of her observation undeniable. "Been thinking about that. All of this, his protection of Luna, his grief response, his awareness now, it challenges everything we think we know about animal consciousness." "Maybe that's the point," Olivia suggested, her professional demeanor softened by exhaustion and emotion. "Maybe Thunder is showing us that the boundaries we've drawn between human and animal experience are more arbitrary than we want to admit." The insight resonated deeply with Mason, echoing thoughts that had been forming since he'd first witnessed Thunder's extraordinary behavior. If a bull could demonstrate loyalty, grief, and strategic thinking that approached human complexity, what did that say about the moral frameworks that justified human dominion over animals? As night settled fully over the homestead, bringing with it the natural sounds of a Texas evening, Mason found himself standing watch again, service weapon close at hand. Catherine joined him, her presence a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been missing in the solitary vigilance of recent years. "You were remarkable out there," she said simply. "Every bit the ranger you've always been." Mason shook his head slightly. "Just doing the job." "No. It was more than that." Catherine's hand found his in the darkness. "It was personal. Because of Thunder. Because of what he represents." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Mason had indeed found himself personally invested in Thunder's safety, in a way that transcended professional obligation. The bull's extraordinary nature had awakened something long dormant in him, a capacity for wonder, for moral outrage, for connection that he had deliberately suppressed after Vietnam. "Maybe," he acknowledged reluctantly. "Still doesn't change the facts. Crawford's team took a hit tonight, but they'll regroup. Next attempt will be more calculated, more desperate." Catherine's hand tightened on his. "Then we'll be ready, all of us together." The simple declaration, "all of us together," carried echoes of their earlier conversation. "We're in this together." The repetition wasn't accidental, Mason knew. Catherine was reminding him of connections reforged, of shared purpose discovered amidst crisis. As if understanding the significance of the moment, Thunder emerged from the stable to stand in the yard, his massive silhouette outlined against the star-filled Texas sky. The bull's posture communicated not fear or agitation, but a dignified vigilance, a sentinel's stance that mirrored Mason's own. In that moment, beneath the vast canopy of stars, the arbitrary distinctions between human and animal seemed to dissolve. There was only shared purpose, shared vulnerability, shared determination to face whatever came next. Together, morning arrived at the Foster homestead with the softness of a held breath, pale light seeping across the eastern horizon to illuminate a landscape transformed by the previous night's confrontation. Additional parks and wildlife vehicles now dotted the property, rangers moving with quiet efficiency as they maintained the security perimeter established after the sniper incident. In the farmhouse kitchen, Mason sat with Catherine, Olivia, and Director Blackwood, the remains of a hurried breakfast pushed aside as they assessed their situation. "Crawford's associate isn't talking," Margaret reported, closing the file she'd been reviewing. "But his fingerprints gave us an identity. Jason Mercer, former military contractor with specialized extraction training. Exactly the kind of person you'd hire for a high-risk animal theft. And exactly the kind who won't give up his employer," Mason added grimly, "no matter what incentives we offer." Margaret nodded in agreement. "We've connected him to 3 previous exotic animal thefts across the state, but nothing that leads directly to Crawford. Your brother," she added, glancing at Olivia, "knows how to maintain distance from the dirty work." Olivia's expression remained carefully neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the emotional toll of discussing Victor. "He always was good at avoiding consequences," she said quietly. "Even as children." "Well, his luck's running out," Margaret stated firmly. "The attempted shooting on a protected animal under parks and wildlife supervision escalates this from property crime to a potential federal case. I've contacted Fish and Wildlife Service to bring in additional resources." The escalation should have been reassuring, but Mason felt a growing unease. Crawford had demonstrated both patience and calculation thus far. The failed extraction attempt would force him to adapt rather than retreat. "He'll change tactics," Mason predicted. "The direct approach failed, so he'll try something less obvious." "Agreed," Margaret said, "which is why we're implementing additional security measures. I've authorized 24-hour surveillance, including aerial monitoring. Nothing approaches this property without our knowledge." The thorough response was impressive, but raised questions about the level of resources being allocated to what was, officially, just one bull. Catherine voiced the thought that had occurred to all of them. "This seems like an awful lot of attention for a single animal, even one as remarkable as Thunder." Margaret's expression shifted subtly. suggesting the question touched on something she'd been reluctant to address. "There are broader considerations," she admitted finally. "Crawford's operation has implications beyond this specific case. Intelligence suggests he's connected to wildlife trafficking networks that extend internationally." "And Thunder is what? Bait in a larger trap?" Mason asked, not bothering to hide his disapproval. "Nothing so calculating," Margaret assured him. "But when rare opportunity aligns with ongoing investigations, we'd be foolish not to leverage the convergence." Before Mason could press further, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see Thunder standing in the paddock behind the stable, his massive head raised and alert, dark eyes fixed on something beyond the perimeter fence. Two rangers were approaching cautiously, hands near their sidearms. "What's happening?" Catherine asked, already moving toward the door. They emerged onto the porch as a Parks and Wildlife radio crackled with urgent communication. "Perimeter breach, east fence line. Unknown vehicle approaching on foot. All personnel to alert positions." Mason was moving before the transmission finished, years of training overriding the caution of age. Catherine and Olivia followed while Margaret coordinated the security response through her radio. As they rounded the stable, the cause of Thunder's alertness became apparent. A solitary figure stood at the edge of the paddock, hands raised in the universal gesture of non-aggression. "Hold your positions," Mason called to the rangers who had their weapons trained on the intruder. "I know him." Victor Crawford hadn't changed significantly in the days since their confrontation at the rehabilitation center. The same weathered face, the same calculating eyes. Only now he appeared unarmed and deliberately vulnerable, his body language carefully non-threatening. "Quite a security detail for one bull," he observed as Mason approached, keeping himself between Crawford and Thunder. "Must be something special to merit all this attention." "You're trespassing on private property," Mason stated flatly. "Again, after your associate took shots at protected wildlife and parks and wildlife personnel." Crawford's expression registered genuine surprise. "If someone shot at you or the bull, it wasn't on my orders. I'm not a violent man, Foster." "Save it," Olivia interjected, stepping forward to confront her brother directly. "We know about the python, Victor. We know you engineered the whole situation to test Thunder's protective response." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, or simply calculation, crossed Crawford's face. "Livy," he acknowledged with a nod. "You're looking well." "Don't," Olivia warned, voice tight with controlled emotion. "Don't pretend this is a social call between family members." Crawford sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. "It's not," he admitted. "It's business." "But not the kind you think." Director Blackwood joined them, her official presence adding weight to the confrontation. "Victor Crawford, I'm Margaret Blackwood, Regional Director for Texas Parks and Wildlife. You're currently in violation of multiple wildlife protection statutes, not to mention trespassing on private property." "I'm aware of who you are, Director," Crawford replied with unexpected courtesy. "And I understand the legal situation. That's why I've come alone, unarmed in daylight. I'd like to propose a resolution that benefits everyone involved." The audacity of the offer, a negotiation after attempted theft and endangerment, left Mason momentarily speechless. Margaret, however, maintained her professional composure. "I'm listening," she said, "though I make no promises." Crawford's gaze shifted to Thunder, who had moved closer to the fence, watching the confrontation with the unnerving intelligence that had marked all his behavior. "That bull represents a scientific anomaly that deserves proper study," he began. "His cognitive and emotional responses are unprecedented in documented bovine behavior. Which is exactly why he deserves protection, not exploitation," Mason countered. "I agree," Crawford said, surprising them all. "My initial approach was mercenary, I admit. I saw a unique specimen with significant market value. But after observing him, particularly his response to the female's death, I've reconsidered my position." Olivia laughed bitterly. "You expect us to believe you've had a moral awakening? After everything you've done?" Crawford's expression hardened momentarily, then softened into something resembling regret. "I don't expect you to believe anything from me, Livy. Not after Jenny. But this isn't about redemption. It's about scientific significance." "Explain," Margaret directed, her tone making it clear that Crawford's continued freedom depended on his next words. "I have connections with a private research foundation specializing in animal cognition studies," Crawford said. "They've been seeking specimens demonstrating advanced emotional intelligence for a long-term observation program. Thunder would be the centerpiece of their bovine studies, protected, respected, studied in humane conditions." "And your profit in this arrangement?" Mason asked skeptically. "Finder's fee. Substantial, but a fraction of what I'd get selling him to an exotic game ranch." Crawford's candor was either genuine or masterfully feigned. "More importantly, professional rehabilitation. The foundation has influence with the Veterinary Licensing Board." The pieces clicked into place for Mason. Crawford wasn't simply after money. He wanted legitimacy, a path back to the professional standing he'd lost. Thunder represented not just profit, but potential redemption. "Why should we trust you?" Catherine asked, speaking for the first time since Crawford's appearance. "After everything you've done to get this bull, why believe this sudden change of heart?" Crawford's gaze shifted to her, assessment visible in his expression. "Mrs. Foster, I presume? You have no reason to trust me. But consider the alternative. Constant vigilance, perpetual threat, resources diverted to protecting one animal indefinitely. I'm offering a solution that serves everyone's interests, including Thunder's." "Except, you engineered this entire situation," Mason pointed out. "The python attack, the surveillance, the attempted theft, all of it was calculated manipulation." "Yes," Crawford admitted without apparent remorse. "I identified valuable specimens and created opportunities to acquire them. It's what I do, what I've done since losing my license, but this bull is different. You've seen it yourselves." The frank acknowledgement of his methods was strangely disarming. Mason found himself reassessing Crawford, not as a simple poacher, but as a complex figure whose moral compromises had specific limits. The man might exploit animals for profit, but even he recognized something in Thunder that transcended commercial value. "What's the name of this foundation?" Margaret asked, her practical focus cutting through the emotional undercurrents. "Cognitive Horizons, based in Colorado, privately funded, impeccable ethical standards. You can verify everything I'm saying." Crawford reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a business card, which he handed to Margaret. "My contact there is Dr. Elaine Winters. She's expecting your call." Margaret pocketed the card without comment, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "You've gone to considerable trouble for this proposal, Mr. Crawford. Why not simply approach us directly from the beginning?" A wry smile touched Crawford's lips. "Would you have listened? A discredited veterinarian with a history of ethical violations, approaching parks and wildlife with a proposal involving a bull he had no legal claim to? Besides," he added, glancing at Olivia, "there are personal complications that made direct negotiation challenging." The understatement hung in the air between the siblings, the weight of Jenny's death and the irreparable fracture it had created. Olivia's expression remained carefully neutral, but Mason could see the cost of that control in the tightness around her eyes. "We'll need to verify everything," Mason said finally. "The foundation, their research protocols, your arrangement with them." "Of course," Crawford agreed readily. "Take whatever time you need. I'll provide full cooperation." "And in the meantime," Catherine asked, "you just walk away and trust us not to press charges for the attempted theft, the python, the shots fired?" Crawford's confidence faltered slightly. I had nothing to do with the shooting. Mercer was acting outside his instructions if he fired on the bull or any personnel. As for the rest, he shrugged philosophically. I'm placing myself at your mercy. A calculated risk, but one I believe is worth taking. Thunder, who had been observing the entire exchange with uncanny attentiveness, suddenly moved closer to the fence, his massive head extending toward Crawford. The bull's nostrils flared as he caught the man's scent, dark eyes evaluating with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species limitations. Crawford remained perfectly still, neither retreating nor approaching, allowing Thunder's inspection. Something passed between man and animal in that moment. An assessment that none of the observers could fully interpret, but all recognized as significant. He's deciding whether you're trustworthy, Catherine said quietly. I'd pay attention to his conclusion if I were you. After a long moment, Thunder withdrew slightly, not in fear or aggression, but in what appeared to be cautious neutrality. He hadn't accepted Crawford, but neither had he rejected him outright, a suspended judgment that mirrored the human's own uncertainty. We'll need to discuss this privately, Margaret announced, breaking the tableau. Mr. Crawford, you'll remain under Parks and Wildlife supervision while we verify your claims. Crawford nodded his acceptance of the terms. Fair enough. I've come this far. I can wait a little longer. As two rangers escorted Crawford to a secure vehicle, Mason turned to Margaret. You're not seriously considering this? I'm considering all options, she replied evenly, including the possibility that his offer is legitimate. Cognitive Horizons is a real organization with an excellent reputation in animal cognition research. You've heard of them, Mason realized, suspicion growing. This isn't new information to you. Margaret's expression confirmed his assessment. We've had previous interactions with the Foundation on Wolf Behavior Studies. Their work is credible and their ethical standards unimpeachable. Whether Crawford's connection to them is legitimate remains to be seen. And if it is? Olivia asked, the question carrying all the complexity of her feelings toward her brother. Then we evaluate the proposal on its merits, Margaret said simply, personal feelings aside. The implication was clear. If Crawford's offer proved genuine, they would need to separate their emotional responses to the man from the potential benefits of his proposal. For Olivia particularly, this represented an almost impossible task, setting aside the grief and rage of her daughter's death to consider an arrangement that might benefit both Thunder and her brother. As the others moved toward the farmhouse to begin the verification process, Mason remained by the paddock fence, watching Thunder. The bull had returned to his customary position, alert but calm, his massive presence carrying a dignity that transcended his status as livestock. "What do you think, big guy?" Mason asked quietly. "Is Crawford on the level this time?" Thunder's dark eyes met his, intelligence evident in their depths. The bull made the soft, rumbling sound that had become familiar over their days together, neither acceptance nor rejection, but acknowledgement of the complexity that faced them all. Inside the farmhouse, the verification process proceeded with methodical thoroughness. Margaret contacted Cognitive Horizons directly, speaking at length with Dr. Winters while Mason, Catherine, and Olivia listened on speakerphone. The conversation confirmed the Foundation's legitimacy and their interest in Thunder, though Dr. Winters expressed surprise at Crawford's direct approach. "We've been discussing the possibility with Mr. Crawford," she explained, her voice carrying the measured precision of a career scientist. "But we hadn't authorized him to make formal arrangements yet. Our understanding was that he would facilitate an introduction once the appropriate permissions were in place." "So he jumped the gun," Mason observed after the call ended, "trying to leverage the situation to his advantage." "Or trying to prevent further escalation," Catherine suggested, "after his associate took things too far with the shooting." Olivia had remained silent throughout most of the verification process, her thoughts clearly turned inward. Now she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of difficult recognition. Victor's always been like this, seeing angles others miss, moving faster than protocols allow. It made him a brilliant veterinarian before. She trailed off, then continued with visible effort. Before the drinking, before the shortcuts, before Jenny. The mention of her daughter's name seemed to physically pain her, but Olivia pressed on. The foundation is legitimate. Their research could give Thunder the protection he deserves while allowing his exceptional nature to advance our understanding of animal cognition. The fact that Victor benefits doesn't necessarily invalidate the arrangement. The admission clearly cost her. Acknowledgement of potential merit in her brother's proposal representing a concession she had never expected to make. Mason recognized the courage it required, the willingness to separate justice for her daughter from Thunder's future. "What about Luna?" Catherine asked quietly. "Her death is part of Thunder's story now. Would the Foundation acknowledge that? Honor it?" The question cut to the heart of their shared concern, that Thunder's grief and the extraordinary bond they had witnessed would be reduced to clinical observation, the emotional reality of his loss diminished in the pursuit of scientific documentation. "We should make that a condition," Mason decided. "If, and it's still a big if, we consider this arrangement, proper acknowledgement of Luna and Thunder's relationship must be central to any research protocol." By late afternoon, they had assembled enough information to make an informed assessment of Crawford's proposal. The Foundation was indeed legitimate, their research protocols ethically sound, their facilities appropriate for Thunder's needs. Crawford's connection to them, while accelerated beyond their standard procedures, was genuine. Margaret called them together in the farmhouse living room, where Crawford waited under ranger supervision. The tension in the room was palpable, years of history and recent confrontation creating currents of emotion beneath the surface of professional discussion. "Here's where we stand," Margaret began, her tone formally neutral. "Cognitive Horizons has confirmed their interest in Thunder and their preliminary arrangement with Mr. Crawford. They're prepared to accept the bull into their research program under specific conditions, including those we've stipulated regarding proper recognition of his bond with Luna." Crawford nodded, satisfaction visible in his expression, though he maintained a respectful silence. "However," Margaret continued, "this doesn't erase the legal issues at hand. Mr. Crawford's actions, particularly the deliberate release of a dangerous invasive species and the unauthorized surveillance of a wildlife rehabilitation facility, constitute serious violations of state and federal wildlife protection laws." Crawford's satisfaction faded slightly, caution returning to his features. "We have two options," Margaret explained. "Pursue full prosecution, which would likely result in significant jail time given the severity and pattern of offenses, or consider a conditional arrangement that serves the interests of wildlife protection while acknowledging Mr. Crawford's cooperation." "What kind of arrangement?" Mason asked, though he suspected he already knew. "A deferred prosecution agreement. Mr. Crawford provides complete information on his wildlife trafficking network, testifies against associates involved in illegal activities, and accepts supervision and restricted movement for a period of 5 years. In exchange, we focus charges on lesser offenses with probationary sentences rather than incarceration." The proposal represented a compromise that balanced justice with pragmatism, holding Crawford accountable while leveraging his cooperation to address the larger trafficking network he had been part of. It was the kind of arrangement that made perfect sense from a law enforcement perspective, but carried emotional complications that transcended legal considerations. "And my brother walks away with his freedom," Olivia said quietly, the statement neither question nor accusation, but simple recognition of reality. "Restricted freedom," Margaret corrected. But yes, he avoids jail time, assuming full cooperation and compliance with all conditions. The room fell silent as the implications settled. For Mason and Catherine, the arrangement offered a resolution that prioritized Thunder's well-being while still serving justice. For Olivia, it represented a more complex equation, balancing the demands of grief against the recognition that perpetual punishment would not return her daughter. "I need to speak with my brother," Olivia said finally. "Alone." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Rangers will remain outside the door." As the others filed out, leaving the siblings in privacy, Mason found himself on the porch with Catherine and Margaret, the Texas afternoon stretching golden across the property. Thunder remained in the paddock, his massive silhouette outlined against the landscape that had briefly become his sanctuary. "Will it work?" Catherine asked, the question encompassing both the legal arrangement and the deeper reconciliation it might represent. "The agreement is solid," Margaret replied. "Crawford has strong incentives to cooperate fully." "I wasn't asking about the legal details," Catherine clarified gently. Margaret's professional mask softened slightly. "Healing after that kind of loss? Between siblings with that much history?" She shook her head. "That's beyond my expertise. But I've seen stranger miracles in my time with parks and wildlife." Inside the house, whatever passed between Olivia and Victor remained private, the content of their conversation known only to them. When they emerged, both appeared drained but composed, some fundamental shift having occurred that was visible even to observers who hadn't heard their words. "I accept the terms," Crawford announced simply. "As do I," Olivia added, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "With one additional condition. Victor will have no direct contact with Thunder once he's transferred to the Foundation. His involvement ends with the arrangement." Crawford nodded, accepting the limitation without protest. "Agreed." The formalization of the agreement required additional hours of paperwork and legal consultation, the bureaucratic machinery of justice grinding forward with deliberate thoroughness. As sunset approached, casting long shadows across the homestead, the essential framework was in place. Thunder would go to cognitive horizons for study and protection. Crawford would provide evidence against the trafficking network in exchange for leniency, and the extraordinary chapter that had brought them all together would close with a resolution none had anticipated at the outset. As the officials departed, taking Crawford with them to begin the detailed debriefing process, Mason, Catherine, and Olivia found themselves alone at the homestead for the first time since the confrontation. The sudden quiet carried both relief and melancholy, the easing of immediate threat balanced against awareness of impending separation. They gravitated naturally to the paddock where Thunder stood in the golden light of evening, his massive presence somehow both magnificent and vulnerable. The bull acknowledged their approach with the gentle rumble that had become his signature communication, dark eyes reflecting intelligence that had changed each of them in ways they were only beginning to understand. "When will they come for him?" Catherine asked, reaching through the fence to stroke Thunder's broad forehead. "Tomorrow afternoon," Olivia replied. "They're sending a specialized transport team with experience handling unique cases." Mason nodded, appreciating the Foundation's thoroughness. "They seem to understand he's not just any bull." "They don't know the half of it," Catherine said softly. "They didn't see him with Luna. They didn't witness what we did." The memory hung between them. Thunder's extraordinary devotion, his grief, his dignity and loss. Whatever scientific observations the Foundation might make, they would be building on a foundation of emotion and connection that the three of them had witnessed firsthand. "We should document it," Olivia suggested suddenly. "Everything we observed, from the Python attack through Luna's death and Thunder's mourning. Create a record that ensures his story isn't reduced to clinical observation." The proposal resonated immediately. That night, Gathered around the farmhouse kitchen table with mugs of coffee and legal pads, they began the process of chronicling what they had witnessed. Each contributed different perspectives. Mason's professional wildlife observations, Catherine's insights into Thunder's emotional responses, Olivia's veterinary documentation of behaviors that defied conventional understanding. As midnight approached, the accumulated pages represented something beyond scientific documentation, a testimony to an experience that had transformed their understanding of what was possible between species, between humans, between siblings, between spouses. "Will we ever talk about this?" Catherine wondered aloud, the question encompassing all that had transpired. "After Thunder's gone, after we go back to our regular lives?" Mason considered the question, thinking of the title Olivia had written at the top of her notes. Observations of extraordinary cognitive and emotional responses in Brahman bull following loss of bonded companion. "Some of it," he said finally. "The scientific parts, the verifiable observations. But the rest," he shook his head slightly. "The way it felt to watch him grieve, to see him understand what was happening, to witness something we don't have adequate language for. I'm not sure we'll ever find the right words for that." Olivia nodded in agreement. "Some experiences change you in ways you can't fully articulate. You just carry them forward, see the world differently because of them." As they prepared for their final night with Thunder, Mason found himself drawn back to the stable, where the bull had settled into his now familiar routine. In the soft glow of the battery lantern, Thunder's massive form appeared both powerful and peaceful, his dark eyes watching Mason with what could only be described as recognition. "Big day tomorrow," Mason said quietly, settling onto the wooden bench. "New place, new people, but they'll treat you right. Make sure your story gets told properly." Thunder's response was the gentle rumble they had come to interpret as acknowledgement, not simply of Mason's words, but of the connection that had formed between them through extraordinary circumstances. "You changed things, you know," Mason continued, surprised by the ease with which he spoke to the bull. "For all of us. Made us see differently. Made us remember what matters." As if understanding the significance of these final hours together, Thunder approached the stall door, extending his massive head toward Mason in a gesture that invited contact. Mason reached out, laying his weathered hand against the bull's broad forehead, feeling the life and intelligence beneath his palm. In that moment of connection beneath the Texas stars, with a lifetime of experiences behind him and unexpected possibilities ahead, Mason Foster knew with absolute certainty that he would never speak publicly about what they had witnessed. Not because it wouldn't be believed, though that was likely, but because some truths were too profound, too personal to be subjected to the dissection of public discourse. What had transpired between Thunder and Luna, what they had all witnessed in the aftermath, belonged to a category of experience that defied conventional explanation. Not supernatural or mystical, but natural in the deepest sense, revealing connections and capabilities that existed beyond human presumptions about the boundaries of consciousness. As Thunder finally settled onto the straw, Mason remained on his bench, maintaining the quiet vigil that had become their shared ritual. Tomorrow would bring change and separation, but tonight there was still this, the simple presence of two beings who had learned to recognize each other across the supposed divide between human and animal consciousness. Some stories, Mason reflected, were never meant to be told in full. Some experiences remained sacred in their privacy, their meaning preserved precisely because they remained unspoken. What had transpired with Thunder and Luna would enter that category, acknowledged in scientific documentation but fully understood only by those who had witnessed it directly. And perhaps that was as it should be. Some truths were meant to be carried rather than proclaimed, their power manifest not in public testimony, but in transformed lives. In the golden years of our lives, we often wonder if true connection still awaits us. The story of Thunder and Luna reminds us that devotion knows no boundaries, not age, not species, not circumstance. Like Mason and Catherine, many of us have drifted apart while living under the same roof, our conversations reduced to schedules and groceries. Yet their journey shows it's never too late to rediscover what first brought us together. When Thunder stood guard over Luna, refusing to leave despite danger, he embodied the love we all seek, unconditional, unwavering, unspoken. Perhaps the most profound connections don't need words, they need presence. Mason's decision to delay retirement wasn't about the job, but about finding purpose again, something many of us struggle with as careers end. The Foster homestead became more than a place. It became a second chance. What unexpected event has reconnected you with someone you love? Has an animal ever shown you the meaning of devotion when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below, because like Thunder watching over Luna, the wisdom of your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.